Hello! Welcome to Normal America Show. Host robnoerr. Great to be back. Had a day or two off. Not from work, I was working, but a day or two off from streaming, so it's good to be back. Money Pit says tree update. Still dead. The tree in my yard is dead. Nerdy Cop. Be careful on patrol, man. Good to hear from you. Beard. Rolling Stunt. Ogre. Peer Review says, let me guess what the stream's about today. Usually, and I know this is an insider secret. Once you get to become a professional streamer like me, I'll give you this advice for free. You ready? Usually, it helps to title your stream something that you're going to talk about. So, very astute peer review to figure out what the stream's about based on the title of the stream. Good stuff. Yeah. Try it out. Work out for you. Iris Southie on Kick. Yeah, I got the Kick chat working. Go over to Kick. Another thing I did today. Hopefully this works. You ready for this? So I think I got my, look at that. All those links should be correct. Got the Kick link up there. The PayPal. Yeah. How about that? So if you just type on Twitter, ! all. Yeah, right, Adventures? It's crazy. It's something I could relate to, though. It's something I could speak on, debate, seeing it's not something I like doing. Unleash Dog. Arf, arf. What do we got? Is that, I think I know who that is. A friend of mine that we get in trouble requesting DMX at weddings together, so. Rob was tweet debating? No, not really. I haven't spent a lot of time on Twitter this week. Oh, he's going after pharma profits. That's what he's doing, yeah. What's up, Gizmo on Kick? Yeah, so that Kick link, I'll put up the links to all my stuff again. The Twitter links right now, the Kick links should be right. Go over to Kick. Eventually I'll be kicked off Twitch sucks. Go to Kick. If you donate to me on Kick, I get a higher percentage of the money and all of that good stuff. So, Twitter's on the way out, Kick on the way up, Rumble on the way up, YouTube on the way out. For me, at least. How does pharma profit if he makes patent-free vaccines? Well, maybe he also is getting paid for appearances and other things like that, or people that he's associated with are getting paid based on not being critical of vaccines. It doesn't even matter if he's personally making money. But we'll get to it, peer review. You'll notice peer review is one of these people too, that what they'll do is they'll take one thing, right, and they'll be like, that explains. Right? There's one thing. Well, if he's not a ridiculous billionaire, then we have to trust everything he says. That's all there is to it. Clearly, he's not profiting off vaccines. If he has patent-free vaccines, he's never made money whatsoever. And so everything that you're going to say in this stream is going to be irrelevant. Peer review, if you would like to come on and get fucking wrecked like you and everyone else does anytime they want to talk about this subject, feel free to let me know. And you could come on and get wrecked like the rest of the lefties. And you could die on that tree of, but if they're patent-free, he couldn't have ever made money. I'm sure he's living in squalor and in poverty. But I digress. We'll move on. But yeah, it was a good weekend. I hope everyone had a fantastic Father's Day. I'm wearing a shirt that my wife and son picked out for me. It says, reigning dad joke champ. He's a... Thank you. Yeah, Father's Day was fantastic. Unfortunately, I worked, so I did not get to see my son on Father's Day, which was kind of a bummer. But, yeah, what can you do? Work is work. Am I going to be on Prime's panel anytime soon? I don't know. I haven't got any invites for a while. Oftentimes those panels suck. Sometimes they talk about things that's just like, I don't know. I don't really have an interest in. But if he gives me a shout out. Mondays are tough because I'm at work, and so, like, for example, I'm streaming now, but I'm off the clock, but if something comes up, I'll just end my stream. If I'm doing a panel, then I affect everyone that's, where's the hat at home, Gizmo? So, but yeah, it was a, I got to talk to my son on the phone. Look, come July, I'm supposed to have some time to go on vacation, have some free time and stuff like that. So I'm just nose to the grindstone until then. That's the plan. So, so let's talk about what's this Joker's name. So for those that didn't hear, Hotez, is that his name? Peter Hotez. Yeah. So let me break it down, right? The specifics that's kind of lighting the Twitter world on fire, and then we'll talk about it more in terms of generalities when it comes to the science, the experts, and just debate in general. So that's the plan for this evening and for the show. So Robert Kennedy Jr., who is at this point the second polling Democrat candidate for president. Now, let's be clear what that means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that, like, he's the Ron DeSantis of the Democrats. So right now, Trump's polling to win the primary and DeSantis is second. And so you would say that really puts DeSantis as a person of stature because he's potentially, you know, in a position to possibly win the primary. DeSantis has a far better chance of winning the primary than RFK for two reasons. One, RFK is seen as an outsider in the Democratic Party, which is the death knell. They're never going to... They'll win... What was it? Hillary, when she was beating Bernie, won like 7 coin tosses in a row or something like that. I'll never forget that. That was fantastic. So, you know, super delegates and all that. The Democrats are very good. They've done a much better job than the Republican Party in making sure that no outsider that would question the establishment line ever rises to any position of prominence whatsoever. And the ones they have that pretend to do, like Bernie Sanders, grovel consistently on the big issues and say, I just want to let you know I am not the revolutionary that I claim to be. I have a third lake house. I would like to keep that. Everyone with $1 more than me is evil, but I am a great person and will do everything the corporatist Democrats tell me to do. That's the truth. AOC, joke. They're all joke. Thank you so much. Way too cool. Appreciate the follow. The other reason is because Biden's the president. And many times, there's not really a serious competitor when you're the incumbent. So, for example, there wouldn't have been a serious competitor for Bush in 2006, running as the incumbent. 2004. So, but, having said that, he still is the runner-up favored to be the Democratic nominee. Not likely, but... It's more likely than it would be traditionally because Biden's so old and could have a health scare at any time. The peer review's available now if I want to chat about this. Sure. Go ahead. So anyways, I'll make it real quick then since peer review wants to talk about this. Let's see. Hotez refused. Hotez was on Joe Rogan's show. He's a big someone who makes vaccines or whatever. RFK's been someone who's been critical of vaccines for a long time. RFK goes on and says a bunch of stuff on Rogan's show. Hotez says that it's dangerous. He called Rogan in the past and tweets far-right adjacent, dangerous far-right ideology, blah, 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 blah. So Rogan calls him out and says, why don't you come on and debate, and I'll give $500,000 to the charity of your choice if you do well. And a bunch of other people threw up. Now it's over $1 million that's being offered. And this Hotez guy, hashtag trust the science, is like, nah, I don't debate. That's not what we do. That's not what scientists do. And so that's where we're at. And so peer review wants to talk about it. We'll bring him on to talk about it. That was 100K to start. All right, my bad. But it's up to, I think it's up to over 1 million. Do some... He probably would, Edmund. While we're waiting here, all of you on Twitch, if you would head over to kick.com/robnoerr and sign up there, I would really appreciate it. Really, really would. And here's the rest of my platforms. Peer review, did you see I put the link to the Discord in there? What's up, Ace Man? Now, I didn't see the entire Hotez Joe Rogan episode, and I also didn't see the entire RFK one. And what I saw of the RFK one, there were things that I don't necessarily agree, both on vaccines regarding this pandemic, but also just in vaccines in general. I think that he overstates his case at certain points. However, my feeling is that it's very similar to what I get, where people just hand wave and say, conspiracy theorist, and don't want to debate me. And the reason it's even more problematic than when dealing with me is, one, RFK is a serious person who's seriously running for president. And so if you think as a scientist that he is saying inaccuracies, you should probably, seeing as how he's polling at about 20% in the Democratic primary, probably want to debate him to correct that. And the other thing is, we've seen how wrong the science has been over and over and over again. So anyone who's just willing to say, well, they don't debate and they just stay in their little bubbles and they go on MSNBC and they go on shows where they have hosts that will not challenge them and that basically, they say you have to believe us. And those policies led to all sorts of disasters. It led to locking down children, masking children, locking down our economy. Thank you so much, Gizmo. I appreciate the cheer. It led to people's parents and grandparents dying alone in nursing homes. All sorts of craziness that it led to. And after they've been wrong so many times, the experts, to watch them say, all right, I put a link up to my room, but to watch them then claim like, oh, you can't challenge us, conspiracy theorists.
Oh, shoot.
I can hear you. I'm not going to put the video up anyways.
Okay.
So
that's fine. How's it going, man?
Good. All right, so you had something to say about the Hotez. Have at her.
Yeah, I was listening to what you were saying, and I agree that like science, I guess, as an institution, kind of needs to do better to, reach out and have these discussions. It's just, I guess, whether or not like Hotez is like the right person, because I would argue that like doing research is different than like science communication, I think.
Well, if that's the case, then why is he on MSNBC, Joe Rogan's show, a litany of other shows? He's one of the public faces of pushing the vaccine when it came to COVID. In fact, he literally went on Joe Rogan's show. And what Rogan's suggesting, and this is something I agree with, if you have two people that disagree substantially, particularly on a scientific matter, oftentimes the best thing to do, if you're Joe Rogan, it's hard. Rogan's not necessarily in a position to be able to push back, right? So if there are two people that are both making a case on separate episodes, to have them come on together seems like the best course of action. And the idea that's like, well, the story that we're hearing from sort of the establishment is it's settled and you can't debate things like this because it's crazy and it's wacky and just giving them air is bad, so it's just settled. And I don't know how they have the nerve to make those claims when they told us the same things over and over all throughout the pandemic that they were wrong about. So where do they get this idea that all of a sudden they're beyond reproach? Because the argument's not just from these people isn't just, well, Hotez isn't the right guy. That's one thing. But if he's not the right guy, why is he talking to Mehdi Hassan today? Why did he go on Rogan's show, right? But even beyond that, the argument, and you tell me if I'm wrong, the argument seems to be from establishment people in the media, Democratic Party and elsewhere, we shouldn't even give people like RFK the time of day because he's a wacky conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess like first on why they're inviting him on specifically. I mean, he's a vaccine researcher, right? He's an expert on vaccines, and so he knows pretty well like the research and development that goes into making a vaccine. So that's if you're talking about vaccines and that kind of stuff, I would go with someone that makes them is a good way
Right.
forward.
And if I was, so think about it this way, right? Let's say that me and you are agnostic on this particular vaccine, right? And we have one guy, RFK, saying, don't take that because blah, blah, blah. I would want someone who knows about the creation of them to be pushing back. I'd want them to be like, no, this is where you're fallacious. This is where you're wrong. This is where you're hyperbolic, right? So if he's the right guy to go on Rogan's show and to go on MSNBC and to go on CNN, then it's clear that he's not just this, introverted researcher who doesn't know how to communicate. The communication seems to be good enough for him to go out as a researcher and talk when he's not being challenged. So is the argument then, well, he's a good researcher and he's good when no one's pushing back against him, but he's just not good when he's being challenged? Is that the argument?
Well, I would argue that science, when you're in research and publishing, there's actually vigorous debate that goes on. Even within a lab, there'll be lots of different debates and approaches on why we should do this versus this approach. And there's a lot of debate in science. It's just communicating that science and that research to lay people is kind of like a different argument, a different skill, I would say. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you in the fact that like if RFK is going on, for an hour, and if he gets invited back on for another hour, then like it kind of seems silly because Joe Rogan's sitting there asking the scientists what RFK said. So it's like it's a weird middleman scenario where you're kind of like, well, just put the person in so that they can substantiate their own claims. You know what I mean? If you're,
Right.
I wouldn't want to debate you by like going to another person and be like, guess what Rob said? You know what I mean? Just talk to Rob. So that's
Well,
my problem with it.
so two things to say, and I know the second one will anger you, so I'll save it. The first thing is, I don't disagree that there are ways for researchers to debate. If you're a researcher, you might not be the best public speaker, things like that. And whether it be scientific arguments, philosophical arguments, there is a rich history of sort of debate in the form of writing, right? So someone writes a book, and then someone writes a book that challenges that. And I understand it's not for everyone, but where I think there's two reasons that I would disagree with that in this situation. The first is, this was something that literally affected every single person's life in this country. And in huge ways, right? Like, I talk to people all the time that are uninterested in politics whatsoever. But COVID was the first time in my life when I talked to many of these people that politics punched them right in the nose. I can't go to work. My kid can't go to school. I can't go visit my mom in the nursing home. Like, these are things that would have been unheard of, 6 months before COVID. And now all these people that just wanted to live their life and didn't care about voting, now it's right in their face. So given that this was so impactful to so many people, I think that it needs to be articulated to people in a way that they could understand. And unfortunately, we could blame whoever we want. Most people aren't reading scientific journals. Most people aren't reading at all, to be honest. And so a lot of people consume information through spoken word, through places like Joe Rogan. And so that's the first reason that I think that having the debate in that sphere would be good. And the second reason is because Hotez clearly understands this because he spent the entire pandemic going on television and giving his advice and telling people to get vaccinated and things like that. So clearly he knows that there is an audience and there's a reason for him to go make his case in these sorts of formats. And it comes across as just weak that both he and many people from our establishment media, etc., are just making the argument, no, you just can't debate these guys. That sounds like something someone would say if they're afraid that they're not going to win, that they're afraid that they don't have the arguments on their side.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There is a way that people need to get involved as scientists to kind of allow things in questions to be asked. And I feel like one of the I want to be conscious of everything, but where everything came from, I'll just put it as that. Like,
You can say whatever you want. I don't get as long. I don't give a shit. YouTube's gonna ban me eventually anyway, so have at her.
Well, let's say this, the origins of everything.
Yeah.
Let's just call it that. When we have on one hand, you have it being banned and off of media platforms. But at the same time, like in the scientific community, those questions aren't banned. That's what there's a big disconnect there that between the origin stuff was researched heavily ever since from the start with tons of genetics and molecular biology, and we were doing tons of forensic work on that. And I feel like the problem is because the layman was tampered down and the content creators were banned from like kind of talking about that. I feel like the general public thinks that there was a ban in the scientific community from studying that, and it's the opposite. It's actually those questions were completely open and studied from the start in the scientific community.
I completely disagree with you. I think the peer review process in the first part is incredibly heinous. It is something that it is clearly, like, for example, if we just look through political ideology, would you at least agree to this, that most people, their ideology, whether it be philosophical or political, input some bias into sort of all of their areas in life, including their research? Maybe some more than others, but you would agree with that, right?
I mean, I think, like, science is political, like, innately, but at the same time, like, I don't feel like the best science is going to ask all the questions available.
Okay, so I don't know what that means, but let me rephrase in this way. Seeing as how we see that coming out of these universities are incredibly philosophically and politically ideological. Like, it's becoming worse and worse and worse. And in those universities, they're censoring sort of the sorts of arguments that you're able to have. This is happening in STEM fields as well. And if you don't believe it, just look at conversations. What is a woman? Can men get pregnant? These are now conversations that are being had in the hard sciences saying, yes, men could get pregnant. No, there aren't biological differences between men and women. So even though there is the theoretical, well, you're allowed to research this, the people that get money, the people that get promoted, the journals that pick these up, they're all geared towards a certain political ideology. And they also have financial incentives. So, for example, right, you said when it came to the origin of COVID, just because it was banned on social media, there was vigorous debate going on in the scientific community. Well, it wasn't that vigorous for several reasons. One, most of the people that were involved in things like gain of function, that would be the people that would know best if that's what caused this, they stood to lose incredibly if it turned out that the very type of grants that they were getting for this research were used to accidentally create COVID. That would mean that there would be a clampdown. There would be people in the United States, the average person, that would say, stop funding this stuff, which means everyone in that field stands to lose all sorts of public money, which is how many of them are able to survive. So they had an incentive financially to be like, no, it couldn't have been that. And secondly, there's also professional incentives where if you're seen as bucking the trend, we've seen, for example, doctors had their license threatened to be revoked. We saw people like Dr. Robert Malone, who also worked in creating vaccines, his name drugged through the mud and smeared, not just in public, but also in the scientific community. So the idea that there was this like even-handed, and what we found out, if anyone, questions this, remember the reason me and you weren't allowed to talk about the origin of COVID was because 47 scientists signed on to a paper from EcoHealth Alliance and its founder Peter Daszak that he wrote and they just signed their names to. He's one of the guys that's now accused of receiving the money from the NIH that worked with the Wuhan lab to create the virus. Many of those scientists came out and said, I regret signing that. I felt pressured into signing it. We saw the same in the UK. We saw a cohort of scientists come out and say, we felt that we were pressured politically and scientifically to fearmonger to people so that political solutions could be put into place. So the idea that it's just, oh no, it's only in the public sphere that we're censoring, it might be not as ham-fisted, but there's certainly a lot of professional and financial incentive, not to mention people's own political biases, that isn't leading to the sort of robust research and the open-handed debates that you're talking about.
I mean, I should say that, there were and still are, the search for, the exact intermediary from the Wuhan lab, from the Wuhan wet markets and that kind of stuff. But the reason why a lot of the, the origins discussions kind of like centered and started narrowing down so quickly is because of the genetic and molecular forensics that came out within the first year of, after the epicenter and the outbreak, where so much of the sequence is found in bat coronaviruses that it's just kind of, it just makes sense that it follows from SARS-CoV-1, and all of the molecular biology and genetics just kind of showed that.
No, I totally disagree. There were certainly scientists that disagreed. There were scientists that said that they thought the furin cleavage site and other things like that suggested that the most likely outcome was this was manufactured in the lab. There were credible... It wasn't just me saying that. This is the thing. When I debate people and they're like, oh, wacky people saying this, I don't know shit about this. So I was reading credible people that were talking about this stuff. For example, the former science writer at the New York Times, I can't remember his name right now, but he wrote a big piece about this. And you could disagree. You could say, no, as a scientist, I feel that it's more likely that it came from bats. Well, now you would agree with this. It seems as if the prevailing theory at this point is that it came from this lab. That's what our intelligence is suggesting. You disagree?
That's not what that's not what the scientific evidence is showing. It's showing, and we have RNA evidence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself, and genetic evidence of raccoon dogs, like in the same sample. How else would you have that type of analysis and those, that happening all at the same time at the same place? And on top of that, we have genetic evidence that there is actually 2 strains that were outbreaking at the same time. So that type of like diversity and everything, it's just, there's no way that it would have be coming from like a lab leak. It would have to be
So according to intelligence agencies, including the FBI, including UK intelligence agencies, as a report that just came out in one of the papers, the Times of UK, I believe it was, all of these intelligence agencies are saying now that it most likely came from a lab. I haven't kept up for quite some time on the exact science that was going behind this, but I think that you're just incredibly factually wrong. I don't think that there's any direct link that has been driven from what animal that was sort of the missing link to getting it to be as contagious as it was to humans. And I think that if we find it, I think that you'll look foolish. What will happen if you continue to go with this line that no, just because it broke out in this very area, right, where we happen to be finding these very sorts of things, where people were warning that this lab was unsecure for years. Nope. It's pangolins or raccoon dogs or something like that. What would you do if, I'll just ask you point blank, you're saying that the scientific evidence shows that it's almost beyond a shadow of a doubt had a natural origin? That's your claim?
Yeah, correct.
I think you look like a fool. Why would anyone trust you scientifically on anything you have to say afterwards if we definitively find out? Like, for example, if Joe Biden comes out and admits tomorrow and says, like, yes, our intelligence shows that now we know that the origin of this came from a lab. We saw through secret communications that this is where it broke out. The first infected people were scientists in this lab, etc., etc. What? You're going to say that, like, the FBI is wrong? They're lying? The UK intelligence is lying?
I don't trust the government to tell me what it is. I trust the scientific data, and that's the thing. So,
okay, can you link it?
They can. The intelligence reports can say whatever they want, but it needs to corroborate with the existing data that we have.
Okay, so link your data. Link the data.
There's about 16 different studies that on like the origins of SARS-CoV-2.
Okay.
I'm gonna have a video coming out walking through a lot of this stuff, but there's here, I can get it for you. I'll post it in chat. The question is like, does science find anything to be 100%? And
of course
not.
No, we both agree with that, of course.
So we could, are we actually, the whole point of science and how we move forward in science is we make a claim and then we can test it. And that testable claim is what we can go on. That's what we can kind of, that's all we can do, and that's why, all the evidence is showing a zoonotic transmission, because that basically goes along with all the other evidence that I was talking about before.
See, I can already tell, even without reading this, none of the evidence that you're going to provide, right, is going to be even remotely dispositive of a lab leak theory. Because it is possible to create in a lab a zoonotic transmission, or to look exactly like a zoonotic transmission, right? Would you agree with that?
Not with the two strains that exist. The epicenter data, the sequencing data it's too varied to come from like a single lab strain. It's impossible.
You show me, I'll look through. Like, if you've said it, we don't have to do it tonight, obviously, because it's something that I want to read through. But put it in my Discord or whatever. Okay. I'll look through it when I have it. I just think that you're completely wrong. I think that I think that I think that the evidence has come out, right. Like, if it was true when we've seen in the past that we've had sort of these mutations that have led to human transmission and things like that, we've in short order been able to find within 12 months the link to the animals that caused this. There's so much circumstantial evidence. There's also evidence that suggests strongly, such as the fear and cleavage sites and other places, or other things like that, that suggest that it most likely came from a lab. Most of the evidence I've seen that suggested that it could have came from nature was exactly that it could have came from nature, but it's not dispositive that it could have came from a lab. For example, it could have came from animals that were being tested on that had these viruses that weren't engineered or something like that were kept in this lab and then leaked out from the lab. That's also a possibility. But I find your certitude of this, even as more and more people are coming out, including intelligence agencies and elsewhere, saying that it's most likely now that it came from a lab. It seems strange, and I just like my stance on it always was I'm not sure. It seems equally plausible. I thought at this point it seems more likely that it came from a lab, but I don't think that either side of that debate should be censored. And what we could clearly see is that one side of that debate was not just censored by politics and by media and by social media, but also there was immense pressure to censor the scientific community and the people that wanted to speak up and talk about those origins. And we found out, in fact, the very scientists, 47 of them that signed on initially, had an incredible financial stake, seeing as how Peter Daszak, the guy who wrote that letter, literally is implicated in this lab and the funding of these sorts of COVID or coronaviruses.
So, I mean, the thing that makes it so that these anti-vax conspiracies and these lab leak conspiracies, and I mean that in the way that like there's no positive evidence in order to show that these events are happening. The problem and the reason why they never are published in scientific journals, and we're talking about thousands of journals, is because they can never get a testable hypothesis and then test it and show it. And that's, I mean, it really is telling that you have amongst thousands of scientific journals all across the world, and none of them will publish this stuff. And I think
that's not true. That's
telling.
Not true. There have been scientists that have came out and said that they think it comes from a lab. So, like,
there's been zero evidence actually showing that it actually has.
That's also not true.
Evidence.
That's also not true. For example, the fear and cleavage site is evidence of something
the fact that a fear and cleavage site exists does not in and of itself mean that it came from
right. And just like the evidence you'll provide doesn't in its of itself mean it came from a zoonotic nature. You'll say this is evidence suggesting this is the most likely outcome. Same with the fear and cleavage site, and there was a bunch of other things, such as the people that were first infected, the lack of sort of the things that we see when there's zoonotic transmissions in the past, particularly with coronaviruses, having sort of that missing link. We haven't seen anything like that. And so you want to have your cake and eat it too, right? You say, no one's saying this. That's not true. People are saying this. You're saying there's no evidence. That's not true. There is evidence. But you're saying, well, none of it's 100% proof positive. I agree. We already made that argument. Very rarely is there something in science that comes across as 100% proof positive. And the problem is what you'll conjecture in the articles that you'll cite, and I can find articles that will rebut from credible people as well, right? But what your articles will say and what your scientific studies will say isn't going to be 100% proof positive. It'll say this is the most likely scenario. There is no smoking gun scientifically that this came from zoonotic exposure. If there was, then why would our intel agencies be looking foolish? When clearly, politically, it behests almost everyone around the world to say this didn't come from a lab. So why all of a sudden is there this turn in the media and in intel agencies if you're saying it's settled? It's already settled. All the science is there. It's almost impossible that it could have came from a lab.
I mean, you're alone in defending the FBI and the intelligence agencies. I'm not going to sit here and defend them, but all I know is the scientific evidence that has been tested and shown, and that none of it links to the lab, none of it links vaccines to cause autism. All of these things that RFK is saying is not been proven, and that's the problem. I mean, that's the big problem with dealing with these people, especially at RFK, when he has some type of legitimacy, which you were talking about. Like, he does have some type of aura of legitimacy because he's running for president, and it's kind of crazy because now we're talking about these same anti-vax conspiracy theories that haven't moved at all in 20 years. It's the same.
But that's not true. Like, you could say there are significant questions about vaccines in general outside of the pandemic that are worth talking about. For example, the rapid nature that we've increased the vaccine schedule, that does seem to be something that my stance is this: before forcing something into people or strongly recommended that they get it, the evidence is incumbent on you. So I didn't need evidence for any of my positions if I have sort of an agnostic position. So, for example, if I think that eating a can of tuna every day is healthy, well, then that's on me. I could eat a can of tuna every day. And if my evidence for that is surprisingly thin, who gives a shit? That's my choice. It's not affecting you. But if I say eating a can of tuna every day is healthy and everyone should be forced to do it, then it's different. Then it's incumbent on me to provide evidence as to why my claims are true. And then I further have to articulate why I should be allowed to force you to do that things. So I don't agree with everything RFK says, and I haven't delved deeply into the vaccine debate, but I do know that there seems to be a massive increase in ways that we don't see in many other contemporary countries in the Western world of how many vaccines we're giving to children. I'm not saying that proves that they're nefarious or anything like that, but it seems to be that someone should be standing up and saying, well, this is why our vaccine schedules are so much more heavy than other countries. And instead of seeing that, I just see people be like, Jenny McCarthy's an idiot, RFK's a conspiracy theorist. No doubt they probably, like anyone, don't have all of their facts correct. But I think that it's worth explaining to the American people why it is that we have so many vaccines when it seems like much of the Western world disagrees with that.
I mean, I think that it's like a privilege, honestly, to have like the more vaccines than less. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Why? Do you acknowledge that there's vaccine side effects?
Like super rarely. It does happen, but it's
to just say that it's a privilege to have more, you would have to have evidence that that the more that we have are a net good.
Oh, for sure, because we have more herd immunity from these things, so we can have less preventable deaths.
Name a vaccine that we have in the United States that they don't have in, say, European contemporary countries that has given us better immunity than them.
I don't know. I mean, whooping cough is a really big one that impacts children specifically.
I mean, I think that, when I've seen this, and listen, this isn't an area that I've dabbled in very much. The only time that I ever really thought about this shit was when I had a son, right? Because it's like, you realize how often you're going in for all these shots. And I myself I had a significant reaction to tetanus vaccine when I was young. I was jaundiced for 3 days, hospitalized for 3 days. So when I went in with my son, I was like, look, I don't know if we should give him this vaccine. And the way the doctor explained it to me was, when I would have got this shot, which would have been, I was born in 84, so it would have been, early 90s, late 80s, I don't know, that it was mixed with other stuff, like other medications, and there was a common reaction to some of those other medications. So I'm probably not allergic to tetanus. I was probably allergic to something else that was in that cocktail. But that was the only time that I ever got interested outside of COVID in vaccine discussion, was when I had a son, and doctors told me a whole life, if you ever step on a rusty nail, tell them you can't have a tetanus vaccine because you're allergic. But I do think that it's interesting how little we know about this, right? It seems interesting. I'm not taking either side at face value. I'm not saying, oh, more vaccines, more rates of autism must mean that it's vaccines. That could be correlation. I don't know. But I also find it amazing how little we know about how many vaccines that we force into children. And, like, there's clearly a financial incentive for that. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. It might be a good thing. But no one's taking the time to explain it. Even when you see debates happen, like I remember that show, The Doctors. They brought on some kooky anti-vax guy, and he started talking. He was like, why do we have 24 vaccines that we force children to have when most European countries have 10? What is the extra benefit that we're getting from these 14 vaccines? Don't quote me on those numbers, but you get the gist of it. And they had no clue. The doctors were just like, and it starts to make you wonder, like, well, if there's a financial incentive and no one could really explain it, they're just like, I don't know, we just do it because we're told we're supposed to do it. You know, I could see how the scientific community is run rampant with other stuff, gender assigning surgery, painkillers, SSRIs, prescribing things like Ritalin and Adderall to children. All of those things have been overdone for financial motives, so why would it be impossible that vaccines would be one of those? And seeing as how, again, I'm not saying that means, this is proof that it causes autism. What I'm saying is, though, to just hand wave it as same old conspiracy theory. Even you seem like you don't really know what all those vaccines are. You don't, like...
Yeah, of course I don't. I have no idea.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, that's fine. I mean, that's okay to me. I'm not... I just wonder, like, when you say it's crazy the things that we don't know, I just wonder, do we really... Is it an unknown to all of science, or are we just not educated on pediatric vaccine schedules? I would say it's probably the latter, right?
I would assume that's the case as well, right? But it is incumbent, like, would you not agree with this? If someone's saying that we're asking you to take this medication as a prophylactic, and not only that, but there are certain public venues that you can't access. For example, in many states, if you're not up on your vaccine schedule, you can't go to public school, right? Which you're aware of. At that point, it seems like they should be explaining to us, well, this is what each and every one of these are, and this is why we're doing it. Particularly when we routinely hear about how good the medical care is in other countries, particularly in Europe, and they're not doing this. So it would be interesting to have someone sit down and say, like, this is why we have double the vaccines that they do in Europe. And there could maybe this is something that's well known in the vaccine community. But I've never heard it, like, laid out so that average people can understand, either in writing or someone talking about it. Maybe you could point me in the right direction. But I think that's a debate worth having.
I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't know the studies well enough in order to point you in that direction. The pharmaceutical thing, I mean, we are kind of conflating, researchers at a university to, like, pharmaceutical companies, but in general, like, vaccines are so cheap compared to the cost of the treatment that, my conspiracy, if I was going to put one out, would be that the pharma companies themselves are driving anti-vax, because then people are actually driven to get, like, things like the measles, and then they make even more money on measles treatment than the vaccine.
But that's outlandish, right? Because
why not? Why couldn't that be?
Because but let me explain, right? Because with the vaccine, it's basically given to every American, so that is a guaranteed 300 million plus that you sell, doses that you sell. How many people are getting whooping cough?
I know, but if the treatment for whooping cough is 1,000, 10,000 times, then
okay. Let's say I would bet that you're being hyperbolic there, which you would agree. I don't think the treatment for whooping but even if it was, now I'm by no means am I a mathematician, but let's say that 10,000 people get whooping cough, right? How much more would you have to charge those 10,000 people, right, than if you're guaranteed selling 300 million?
I mean, that'd be a large amount on the
Right.
treatments.
So I don't buy your argument that like, oh no, if they didn't do these vaccines that they stand to make more money. Outrageous. Like, couldn't the same be said of COVID then? Right? Well, it would have been better, you know, if hell, they would have been pushing what Paxlovid and remdesivir and all this shit, right? Why even come up with the vaccine then? They would have made a ton more money without the vaccine, right?
True. Yeah, they would have.
No, they wouldn't have, and you know that's not true. They made record profits with the vaccine.
Oh, there's a new paper coming out that said like there would have been like 3 million more people in the hospital if the vaccines were never developed. So for sure, for sure there.
But that's not that those companies, for example, Pfizer doesn't necessarily get the money just because someone's in the hospital. You have to use treatments that they own and develop. Right?
Exactly. There you
go. Okay. So the idea then that they were losing money creating these vaccines. It's nonsensical. They're having record profits.
They have so many different products in there, in the hospitals and stuff. You sound reasonable, but if this is a hill you're going to die on, this is a joke. No, I'm not.
Anyone with half a brain can see that these pharmaceutical companies made record profits pushing these vaccines. That's not to say if they're good or bad. It's just the truth.
I propose that conspiracy not as something that I truly believe, but it's just interesting that is something that isn't even.
But no, I'm not saying. I'm saying
I think that
the conspiracy.
The point is,
the conspiracy that you're saying is based on what you say is true, right? You're not saying that they actually were going to withhold a vaccine because they would have made more money selling remdesivir, right? But you're saying. But it could be something that would have happened because they would have made more money with the treatments than the vaccines. I'm saying you're wrong. Kernel of truth.
I don't believe that the vaccines are such a big profit that they're willing to. All these companies made all this money because there's a lot of pharmaceutical companies that didn't do the COVID vaccine because of the cost. There's a couple of different biotechs that just couldn't do it. They couldn't get the scale right. They couldn't get the reproducibility.
Can you
right,
explain?
So they stopped.
Can you explain how they made record profits then, if they were losing money with the vaccines?
Well, there's just a lot of investment that the government did. Obviously with buying it at cost, right? And as these companies were able to make a profit and expand through the the global markets, you do have them selling to other companies. Absolutely.
When you have a guaranteed market where you're basically mandating that people take these, and then it's like, oh, and by the way, you have to take the booster every 6 months. They're making money hand over fist.
I don't necessarily know. Trump.
They
Trump
are.
Actually,
it is beyond dispute because we've seen their financial records. They are making record profits.
Trump actually negotiated a vaccine deal from Moderna and Pfizer and got those vaccines at cost for like 100 million doses, over 100 million doses or something crazy like that. It was insane. So and they were like normally like over $100 a shot, and Trump negotiated it down to like $15 a shot. So I wouldn't say that they were they weren't charging full price for all of those vaccines.
COVID pandemic drives Pfizer's 2022 revenue to a record $100 billion. $37.8 billion as a result of their vaccine. I could, if you want, I could do the same for apparently there is a large conspiracy that Pfizer is falsely reporting their earnings. They're actually losing money or breaking even, but all of the reports that they're making record profits, according to you, is just fallacious. That's not true.
No, I think it was Novavax that was like doing RNA vaccines. They were like an actual RNA vaccine company, and they had to abandon the RNA the vaccines for COVID because it was too costly.
Pfizer made nearly 37. This is the Guardian, right-wing rag, the Guardian. Pfizer made nearly $37 billion in sales from COVID vaccine last night, making it one of the most lucrative products in history from 1 year.
Yeah.
So your claim that it wasn't making them big money is nonsensical. It was one of the most lucrative products in history of the world. And you're like, no, it wasn't that much. It didn't make that much money.
Are you disputing the fact that Trump made that deal?
Can I give you a little advice, right? When you're having discussions like this, when you dig in on a position that is so nonsensical, it diminishes anything else that you might be saying. Because anyone watching thinking, oh, okay, peer review sounds pretty reasonable, to hear this statement, it's so nonsensical. Why would we believe anything you're talking about the origins of COVID then? If you're misrepresenting something that is verifiable, easy for the average person with just a few keystrokes to look and see that you're absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt wrong, then why would we believe you when it comes to something that would require some more research, like the origins of the vaccine?
Check out the deal that Trump made with these vaccine companies.
What does it matter? So they made, okay, so let's assume that that's true. Let's say that Trump made a deal, right, with the vaccine companies that they broke even. That the money they put into research and development and then what Trump paid them, it was just that they broke even. They still made $37 billion on the vaccine. So clearly, if your argument is true,
the entire quarter
on the vaccine, just the vaccine, they made $57 billion in total. They made $37 from the vaccine. Now, so if your argument is true, like let's steelman your position. But when Trump was buying the vaccines, no one was making money. None of these pharmaceuticals were making money, right? They were all breaking even. Then clearly, after Trump, they made a heyday.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So then, what does it matter? The claim. What we were talking about is whether or not they made large amounts of money and they have financial incentive to sell these vaccines. And you saying, but when Trump was there, they didn't. Well, maybe they read the tea leaves and understood that they were eventually going to make money. And you're just wrong about them not making money when Trump was buying it at cost. They were still making tons of money then as well. But I don't know what to say. The evidence is there for anyone to see. I could link article after article after article. If it would make you feel better, I could try to find a document from Pfizer itself, from Johnson & Johnson, their earnings reports or something like that. But I don't think you're providing any evidence to dispute the publicly available information. That the only thing I've provided so far is that the Pfizer alone made $37 billion in 1 year in 2022 on the vaccine alone. $37 billion.
Sure, and I mean the mRNA Moderna profits are going to be even higher on the ROI. I mean that would be the one to cite if you wanted to really make your case.
Anyways, so the idea then, so talking specifically about, vaccine conspiracies, there was research that I did. So I'll give you in a nutshell. You tell me if you think I'm wrong, right? Okay. I think that any medication has side effects, right? If you take Robitussin for a cough, there's potential side effects to that, right? What we do is anytime we're taking any sort of medication, it's a cost-benefit analysis. So the small risk of taking a side effect from Tylenol is outweighed by the fact that that risk is so small, and the benefit of taking Tylenol is it'll cure your headache or something, right? But you don't just take Tylenol when you're feeling fine, because there is an ever chance of long-term effects if you take it every day or possible side effects, right? You would agree with that, right?
Yeah, I'm following.
Yeah. So my feeling on the COVID vaccine was I think that some people are overselling how bad it is, right? My feelings were always, this was my gut feeling, that there certainly was a financial incentive, that they probably didn't do adequate testing, and it probably was rushed because there was such a financial incentive. But it probably did benefit people. I feel that if you had a high risk of COVID, you had many comorbidities, were over the age of 75, etc., then probably it was of net benefit to you to take the vaccine. I'm not sure, but that was my gut feeling. But if you're a healthy person, like a 23-year-old without any comorbidities, then the risk of you having a significant case of COVID was low enough that the potential side effects from this rushed, almost unknown, unprecedented vaccine seemed to be something worth worrying about. The problem I had was when we said no one could question it, and we're going to force people to do this or we're going to make their lives hell. So the OSHA mandate that Biden tried to push forward, all sorts of rules in public settings that you couldn't have. You had to have a vaccine passport, for example, in New York, places like that, to do simple things like grocery shopping. That to me was what was monstrous. And I think the evidence is quite compelling that in certain populations that the potential side effect risk far outweighed the benefit of taking the vaccine.
Well, I mean, the side effects that you're talking about are, from myocarditis and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's way higher with SARS-CoV-2 itself. So if you're worried about, obviously I'm not a medical doctor. Everything you should, talk to your medical doctor about it. And if you're safe, in order to take the vaccine, then it's a good idea, because you're basically being exposed to less myocarditis risk. Is basically how it is, and there were human trials, 3 full human trials. That the third one, by the way, that Trump tried to actually end early. So I'm happy that he didn't. He wasn't able to do that. They did do it, and there was billions of tests through the administration of this thing worldwide. So just like you were talking about, Pfizer's and Moderna's vaccine were able to go global, and we haven't really seen vaccine injuries that are noticeably higher. There are increases amount of VAERS, which is, by the way, run by the NIH itself. So I would say that that's like a huge win for open science and transparency. But the VAERS list itself isn't like published reports and verified. So you have to go through, as a scientist and a data scientist, to mull through that and try to make any of the corroborations. But the fact is that when it first came out, the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine was the most efficient vaccine, the best one that's ever been developed. It was over 95% efficacy, compared to the normal like 60% for a flu. So it honestly was pretty incredible.
Okay.
Obviously, there was a lot of evolution and changing of the virus, so it started wane over time. But that would be my argument for anyone that was on the fence and like, I'm safe and healthy. Why do I need to get the vaccine? It's like, well, because you're increasing to the mutation of the virus.
Now, so you said a lot there. Like, we'll take them one by one. First, I agree with you that, like any medication, that you shouldn't just listen to some jack-off like me online. That's why I said from the get-go, I'm not going to shame you if you took the vaccine. I'm not going to shame you if you didn't. The best course of action is to find a medical provider you trust that knows your unique health situation and make the best possible, decision you can for your life. If you trust your medical provider and they tell you you should take this vaccine, they probably know more about your situation than me. If you don't trust them, then seek a better doctor, So but the problem is that we treated this like a one-size-fits-all approach, and we said that anyone who had any legitimate criticism should be censored, and that they should be criticized. And then we said that we're going to make people's lives hell if they don't take this one-size-fits-all approach. And a lot of what you said there is just incorrect. So, for example, there was never... Originally, one of the things that was quite evident from the first large study, the Israeli study, was that natural immunity was superior to vaccinated immunity. But we were told that that was a crazy conspiracy theory. Hashtag trust the science. That's what Fauci and Birx, all of them were telling us. Do you now acknowledge that natural immunity seemed to be superior?
No, what they're talking about there is that they're talking about the different types of antibodies that are developed in the course of a natural infection. So a natural infection, you're going to get antibodies that correspond with different parts of the virus, versus just the vaccine, you're only going to get the spike. So that's what they're talking about. You do get a diversity in antibodies.
Right, but that's interesting that you say that. But how would we? In what ways will we measure which antibodies would be better, natural or vaccinated? How would we? In what ways would we measure that?
Well, I mean, I would look at the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated populations. But I mean, again, the Israeli studies are
populations.
Kind of odd
Populations what? We would look at hospitalizations, infected rates,
death rates.
Right, right. So that's how we would decide. And that evidence has been clear from the get-go that those that had natural immunity, had a prior case of COVID, were more well protected than the vaccinated. That is indisputable in their transmission rates, in their hospitalization rates, in their death rates, in all three.
But you have to survive the original.
Okay,
infection.
But no one's saying, right?
Point.
This is right, but no one's saying, oh, like, the old wives' tale about chickenpox. Like, once one kid gets chickenpox, everybody they put all their kids in the bed with them to all get it. No one's saying that. We're saying that there were millions upon millions of people when these mandates were being forced. The OSHA mandate, there were millions of people that had already had COVID. So should they be forced to take this vaccine? And if they
it's hard to know. Yeah.
What do you mean it's hard to know? Those people were more well protected than the vaccinated.
If you had like a severe COVID infection, so again, SARS-CoV-2 is different than COVID. So SARS-CoV-2 is going to be the virus, and if you actually develop severe COVID-19 symptoms, then you're going to get robust antibody expression, and your body's going to be able to make a lot of it. But some weird thing that we've noticed with SARS-CoV-2 research is that basically people once they get infected with SARS-CoV-2, they don't necessarily develop COVID-19 symptoms, severe ones. So what that means is that their antibodies don't get made.
You're factually okay. So let me ask you this, right? I believe you're incorrect. So here's what we'll do. Okay. We'll try to look at some data. What are the types of places or outlets that I should be going to for data you trust? Because I don't want to link something and then have you go, I don't trust that. That's a bad site. So give me the types of places. Where should we be looking? Like World Health Organization?
New England Medical Journal.
Okay.
Is going to be a good one. The Lancet's a good one.
Okay. What about CDC?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad you said that. So let's look at the January 2022. This study from the CDC, one of the largest of its kind, analyzing COVID cases in California and New York from May to November 2021. Now, the reason this is significant is for two reasons. One, it is the most recent paper such as this that I've been able to find from the CDC. Admittedly, I haven't checked in the past 3 months, so maybe there's a newer one. And second, this was occurring at the time when Biden was trying to force mandates on people through OSHA. So this data is significant. It also looked at millions of people, so it's going to make it significant. Now, your claim was that the natural immunity would only be effective if you had, I'm quoting you, right? I don't want to strawman you. Only if you had a severe case of COVID, correct?
Yeah, that's usually how people develop a robust antibody.
All right. So I'm going to link this paper to you. I'm going to put it in the Discord, in our little chat there. Okay. And you can follow along with me if you like.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, November 2021, a little long away, but it's okay.
May to November. The paper came out in January 2022, but this was data looking at May to November 2021. Okay?
When did the vaccine come out?
The beginning of 2021.
Okay, cool.
So go to page 5.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Wait, I'm sorry. See the chart there? Now, do you see
there's hazard ratios?
You're on page 5, right?
Okay.
And there's like a bar graph or a line graph.
2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, yeah.
You see the line graph, estimated hazard rate? Now, there's 4 populations that they're looking at, right? Unvaccinated with no previous COVID diagnosis, unvaccinated with a previous COVID diagnosis, vaccinated with no previous diagnosis, and vaccinated with a previous diagnosis. You see that, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Notice the line for unvaccinated previous COVID diagnosis is lower than those with vaccinated with no previous diagnosis. Notice that?
Okay.
You understand what that's saying? That natural immunity was superior. Now, we'll go up into the data and see how they collected it. Spoiler alert, it's not just pure... They didn't say people with severe previous COVID diagnosis. It was any COVID diagnosis.
How would you know if you had COVID-19 unless it was a severe reaction? You wouldn't have tested yourself.
That's not true. Many people, particularly in California and New York, were getting tested all the time anyways. And maybe you had an unsevere case. Maybe you went to the hospital because you had the sniffles and you tested positive for COVID. Or maybe you went to the hospital for something. So you're claiming that this data is incorrect. You're claiming that the CDC...
I'm saying that if you tested yourself, you were developing some type of symptoms. So, you were developing some type of COVID-19 symptoms to test yourself. So you were you're on that range of like, okay, your body's actually responding, and as opposed to like an asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread.
It's an outrageous, right? It's an outrageous line of questioning that people like you that are wrong on this issue will try to provide. So you'll selectively say, oh, well, if you had a previous diagnosis, it had to be a severe diagnosis. You have no evidence for that. For example, I had a COVID diagnosis. It was unsevere. Or I'm sorry, my wife did. I had one that was mild, but it was enough to notice, right? When you say severe, that implies to me that required like a stay at the hospital. Almost everyone I know that got COVID knew they had COVID but didn't have a severe case of it.
Okay.
But you're saying those people lied? How would they have known they had COVID unless it was severe? I mean, this is nonsensical.
Well, I mean, they're obviously, again, I mean, they've definitely survived the COVID-19, whatever they had. It was a previous COVID-19 diagnosis. So, you basically, the body is going to be able to like withstand mutations. It's called like hypermutation. Basically, the body allows itself to adapt the antibodies to different mutations inside of the virus. So it makes sense that someone with a previous COVID-19 diagnosis would actually do pretty good as the virus mutates.
That's right. It does make sense, which is why your initial claim was nonsensical. It made sense that if you actually got the virus, that it would be superior than to getting a vaccine. That's what all the data showed early and often, and yet we were told the exact opposite. We were told that Go ahead.
The problem is that not everyone can survive that previous COVID-19.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like, for example, here's why, right? Let's say by the time, hypothetically, when the vaccine came out, 80% of the people had a previous case of COVID. Now, whether they survived or not, irrelevant. But at that point, we didn't have another option, right? At those points, do we force those people to be vaccinated? Because that's what our government wanted to do. It wanted to force those people to get vaccinated. If you remember, the mandate that was put forth by Biden said any company over 50 people, everyone had to be vaccinated or they had to be tested every week. Now, this was despite the fact that many millions of people already had COVID and survived. So at that point, you could say, well, if you've never had COVID, should you take the vaccine or should you intentionally go out and attempt to get COVID? No one's suggesting that. We're saying these people already existed. And yet our government treated them like shit and forced them to take a medication that was not beneficial to them. But the people that were vaccinated, that didn't have a previous COVID infection, why weren't they tested every week under this mandate? They were more likely to contract, have a serious case, and die of COVID. So why weren't they being forced to be tested if it was all about just making sure that we stop the spread of this?
I mean, basically, what you'd be asking is for it's called a serology test. So you take a blood sample from everyone, and then you check to see what their antibodies are. So I mean, and that's a lot of money, man. Like in order to do that and to test it, there's the.
Well, nonetheless, we could say this. We could say the same with the vaccinated. It doesn't. You can't get around this. The people that had previous infections did better in every example, in the severity of COVID and the transmission of COVID. And so, if our argument is, well, sorry, we have to make your life hell, even though you had a previous COVID infection, because we're not sure if you have the antibodies. If I could say, but wait a minute, if we look just in general, those that had a previous infection, on average, are doing far better than those that are vaccinated. So shouldn't they be forced to get this blood test or be tested every week from COVID as well?
Well, no, because that big, thick, unvaccinated, no previous COVID-19 diagnosis, that estimated hazard rate is way, way, way higher.
What does that matter? The mandate didn't say only people that haven't had COVID and aren't vaccinated. That's not what the mandate said. The mandate said everyone who's not vaccinated. No, it's the whole point is this is what I'm talking about. You've already backtracked, right? Like we could see that it was evident. It made sense that people that had contracted the illness would have more antibodies to it, right? That just makes sense. Then when we saw the Israeli study that came out like in 2021 that looked at millions of people and it showed, yep, the vaccinated are doing, or the natural immune are doing far better than the vaccinated. We were told all the while, that's a lie. That's a crazy conspiracy theory. Don't talk to these crazy anti-vax conspiracy theorists. Now, I want to go further into what this study shows. So now, if you go to Table 1 on page 3.
Okay, I still don't understand why you trust all these numbers, but then you wouldn't trust their own data on the unvaccinated, no previous COVID-19 diagnosis.
Who says I don't trust it?
Okay,
When did I say I don't?
What it's saying here is that
Here, wait, stop for a second. I gotta get up for 1 second. I won't be able to hear you. 1 second.
Okay, no problem.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I think what it's saying is that basically the mortality rate is much higher for the unvaccinated, no previous COVID-19 diagnosis.
Why is that relevant to the conversation we're having?
Well, because people don't know if they're in that unvaccinated, no previous COVID-19 diagnosis or unvaccinated
that's
previous
not true.
COVID-19 diagnosis.
That's not true. Many people know that because they've got a diagnosis of COVID.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean that is like a part where, I think that the best protection that you could have would be, having it all, so that's kind of the best way because you're making sure.
No, it's not the best way. It's not the best way, as we'll get to. All right, so if we go to page 3, table 1 of page 3, it's comparing California and New York, 4 groups. The 4 groups we already talked about. Those that are unvaccinated that had a previous infection and didn't, and those that are vaccinated that had a previous infection and didn't. Let's start with California. Page 3, table 1. Someone said they like studies with hundreds of thousands of people, not with the CDC. Well, this one, vaccinated with a previous COVID diagnosis, was 968,000 and change people they looked at. There were 3,471 cases over the time of this study. Unvaccinated with a previous COVID diagnosis, 1.3 million and change they looked at. There were 6,805 cases. In other words, if you had a previous infection and are unvaccinated, there were only 6,805 total cases, which could be asymptomatic or more, out of over 1.3 million. That puts your chance of having COVID in this time period, even in an asymptomatic case, if you were unvaccinated with a previous infection, at 0.4964%. And if you had previous infection and get vaccinated, your chance slightly decreases to 0.3585. So the argument being used to justify forcing the naturally immune to get vaccinated is that you go from an already minuscule less than 0.5% chance of getting COVID to a slightly less 0.35% chance of getting COVID. That's the argument?
Well, considering that some people might not know, yeah, that makes sense.
What do you mean some people might not know?
If they've had a previous COVID diagnosis, they might not know. So it's hard when
Let me ask you that. How would you not know? So explain to me the type of the person that goes to the hospital, gets told, okay, you took a test, you got COVID, and then like 2 months later, they're like, I don't know if I had a diagnosis. I forget about that.
Well, I've never tested positive personally.
Okay.
And I've
then
never had COVID.
So let me ask you this. You've never tested positive personally, right? So if you were in this CDC study, would you have been considered a person with a previous COVID diagnosis or not?
I don't know. Do they do serology tests?
No.
I don't know.
It's a previous diagnosis. The question is, did you have a previous diagnosis?
The diagnosis, no.
Okay. That's the way they're measuring this. That means that unless people are lying, every person they looked at that said they had a previous COVID diagnosis knew that they had a previous COVID diagnosis. Now, you're right. There could be people that had COVID but had no idea because it was asymptomatic. Those people, and they may have natural immunity, they may have the antibodies, but those people would be to the benefit of the other side of the ledger because they would be counted as people without a previous COVID infection because there's no diagnosis, so there would be no way of knowing. So that makes this study even better. So when we're talking about the efficacy and natural immunity, it is true that there could be those with natural immunity that didn't know they had it, which would mean that it's even better. But I digress. So that's what we're forcing for that minuscule benefit, right? But the problem with that benefit, as you've already said, is that we always weigh cost benefit, and that even if they're minuscule, there are side effects that occur, right? So let's go further with this if we're still looking at that table. Now, no one really gives a shit if you get a COVID diagnosis. What they care is if you get a serious COVID diagnosis. So, for example, if you're sick for 2 days with what seems to be the common cold, but it's COVID, that's not a big deal. That's why no one freaks out about the common cold. The reason COVID was serious was because people were dying, because people were being hospitalized, right? You acknowledge that, right?
Agreed, yeah.
All right, so that's when we're looking at severe cases of COVID. Maybe it is that those with natural immunity, even though they get COVID less than those with vaccinated immunity, maybe they get more severe cases. So let's look at those numbers. Let me bring it up again. If the government could justify this much, forget that. The New York numbers aren't much better. They're basically the same. It's only part of the story. I wrote this, by the way, in February 2022. So back to the same groups. Let's look at those that required hospitalization. Vaccinated with a previous diagnosis is 968,000 people they looked at. 273 cases requiring hospitalization. Unvaccinated with a previous diagnosis, again, they looked at 1.3 million and change. 378 amount of cases requiring hospitalization. You read that right. Out of 1.3 million people with a previous diagnosis, according to the CDC, 378 had to be hospitalized. That's nothing. Right?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, I mean, that is a small amount.
Okay, but then it gets even worse, right? Over the course of this study, if you had a previous infection, you had a 0.0276 of being hospitalized with COVID. And if you forced those people to get vaccinated, the chance of being hospitalized slightly increased to 0.282%. Now, that's probably within the margin of error. I'm sure you would agree with that. But there's no benefit. And if anything, there's a small detriment. If you had a previous infection, there's either no benefit or it actually makes it a little more likely that you'll be hospitalized. Why would we force medication into people that does no benefit to them or possibly makes it worse for them?
I mean, I don't know the source on that. I would have to look at it more. But I mean, in general, we would actually assume that there would actually be more deaths or even hospitalizations with people that are vaccinated, because there just are more of them. So if 70% of the population is vaccinated, then it makes sense that you'd actually have people dying.
But that's not true.
Vaccine.
That's not true. In fact, it's the exact opposite. First, we're talking percentages, not total amounts of people. And second, even if that were the case, look at the two groups. The vaccinated group is 968,000 and change that they looked at. The unvaccinated is 1.3 million. So even in the general population, we're talking about those looked at in this study. There were actually more looked at that were unvaccinated and had a previous diagnosis than were vaccinated and had a previous diagnosis. And over that period, you were more likely to be hospitalized if you had the previous diagnosis and were vaccinated. That means if you forced someone with a previous diagnosis to get vaccinated, albeit within the margin of error, which I'm fully admitting, their chance is slightly increased of them being hospitalized.
Okay. I mean, I guess I'm just I'm confused on... It's interesting that you're linking to CDC studies. So, I mean, is this
one study?
But are you saying then that, I mean, that the CDC is pretty transparent then, right? Because they're putting out information that would prove your case, or
I'm saying
they want to scrub this.
Well, that's interesting. So the argument that you're making, then, let me see if I track you here, is then one, I have to admit that the CDC is beyond reproach. We have to believe anything they say. And second, if this says what we think it says, which it does, the numbers are there. If you want, I can bring up a calculator and show you right here if you want.
No, that's fine.
Then they would have buried this because they're corrupt.
I mean, it seems like they're reporting data here, and you've gone through and you understand the data really well. So I'm just curious why you trust the CDC on this study.
Because, for example, do you like Trump?
I mean, I'm independent.
Okay. Do you like Trump?
I mean, I'm a scientist, so I don't know what to tell you.
So you're just not going to answer the question?
Not personally. I don't like him, no.
Would you vote for Trump or Biden if you had to pick one or the other?
Biden all the way, man.
Okay. Would you acknowledge that a place like, let's say, Breitbart is in the tank for Trump, probably more likely to support Trump?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Do you trust Breitbart?
I could. I mean, it's about what the data that they present.
But you understand that they have a bias. Let's assume that you don't trust them.
For
It's
sure.
like pulling two, right? What if they put out an article saying Trump really messed up on this situation? If you pointed to that and said, look, even Breitbart is saying that Trump screwed up, does that mean, oh, you must trust Breitbart on everything? Or is that you using the source that the people that disagree with you would say, well, that's a source I trust, and so you're using that very source to show how even it doesn't make the case that that person is trying to make?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand what the point that you're making. I mean,
So
it's just,
then the question becomes, because, and the reason you said, right, you give the game away when you say, well, why wouldn't the CDC have covered this up? And the reason you're saying that is because you know what the messaging of the CDC was, right? What was the messaging?
sure.
Everybody get vaccinated.
Yeah.
Even if you have natural immunity, get vaccinated, right? That was their messaging, correct?
Sure, yeah.
So isn't it odd that their data seems to suggest that that's not necessarily the best course of action?
I don't fully I haven't read this paper in full and stuff, so it's hard for me to come to that conclusion.
That's fair.
But
But let's say you do read the paper later and I'm accurate about the numbers, right? And that there's almost no chance if you had natural immunity of being hospitalized or getting COVID. There's less than half of a 1% chance of being hospitalized. And your chance slightly increases, albeit within the margin of error, if you're vaccinated on top of natural immunity. If that's true, do you think that the CDC was at best negligent and at worst intentionally duplicitous in their messaging on vaccines?
I don't think that I don't think that the science communication was very good about it. But I mean, even in the same report in the discussion, it says, quote, vaccination protected against COVID-19 and related hospitalization, and surviving a previous infection protected against a reinfection and related hospitalization during periods of predominantly Alpha and Delta variant transmission before the emergence of Omicron.
Okay, let's
So,
see the
that
data.
makes sense.
Well, let's see the data when it comes out to Omicron, right? Why would it? So if we have, right, you, for example, when talking about the origins of COVID, one of the things that you mentioned was we've seen things in the past. We understand how coronaviruses work because of things we've seen in the past. And you think that this is matching up with coronaviruses we've seen in the past in certain ways that had zoonotic origins, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So it makes sense that what we do is we take what we know about a virus and what we know about the past, and although we leave caveats that things could change, obviously, that's the best evidence we have, right? So, for example, we know there's a new variant of flu every year, but we kind of have an idea of what to expect because we know what the flu is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so given that, right, isn't it incumbent on the CDC or those that want to push, particularly those that had a previous infection, of taking a vaccine to explain to us or show data why it would be different from Alpha and Delta to Omicron?
Well, I mean, it says in the report that you linked, evidence suggests that decreased protection from both vaccine and infection-induced immunity against Omicron infections, although additional protection with widespread receipt of booster COVID-19 vaccine doses is expected. So with the waning, with Omicron coming out, that they would have expected some type of additional.
But the question is, what's better, vaccinated or natural immunity? That's the question, right? Saying that there's waning efficacy of both of those doesn't say that the vaccine's better. Right? There's no reason to suspect that magically Omicron would make it, oh, now the vaccinated immunity is superior to the natural immunity. When both with the Alpha and Delta, that wasn't the case. And when they were telling us during Alpha and Delta that natural immunity was bullshit. They were wrong.
Well,
They were wrong. They censored people.
What it says is that we need some type of bivalent booster, and that's exactly what happened. So
Well,
that's a good thing.
right. And then we'll have to see whether or not those boosters, right, whether they made it so you were more likely to have other comorbidities or more likely to contract COVID, had serious case, etc., after the efficacy of the booster ran out. Right? Because what this is an argument for then is like, well, you got to get your booster every 3 months. Right?
Six. Yeah, but yeah.
Okay. So now here's the problem. So far, we've looked at, I'm in a debate mind because that's what I did in college, right? You have two types of arguments in debate. You have defensive arguments and you have offensive arguments, right? So the defense would be, into the position I'm making is, well, how much benefit did you get by forcing those with the previous infection to get vaccinated? Answer, zilch. Almost none. In fact, slightly increased their chance of being hospitalized. But we haven't got to the offense yet, right? And you've already admitted that we don't take Tylenol if you're not sick because, albeit small chance of any sort of side effect, there's always that chance, right? So I'll link some other articles here. Now, I specifically chose articles that were concluding that vaccines are good because I didn't want to be accused of, just finding anti-vaxxers. So I found journals that were done. Just one sec, I'll link them all for you. And maybe you'll look at them and tell me that these are no good. And I certainly don't expect you to go through them all right now. One more. Oops, sorry. Okay. Now let's talk about side effects. Oh, I'm sorry. So I went to the Israeli study on natural immunity. I linked that there. It's the same thing. It looked at 14,000 people who had previous infection and those that were vaccinated and see what they found. Symptomatic disease was present in 16 single-dose vaccines and in 23 of their unvaccinated counterparts. One hospitalization in the unvaccinated previously infected group. No mortality. So out of over 14,000 people, only 23 cases of symptomatic COVID for those that had a previous diagnosis. That number decreases to 16 if they're vaccinated, which is nothing. So forcing these people to get vaccinated seemed to be ridiculous. Now, the first study is the UK study. And that one's
Israel's a weird case because they only had access to that single.
Yeah, but the fact that those numbers are buttressed by the California and New York studies that the CDC did that was looking at millions of people seems to suggest that they were onto something. So now I typed this out, so I don't know exactly where it's at there, but I sought to see if people that had been previously infected with COVID or had natural immunity were more likely to have side effects from the vaccine. Their answer, yes. Figure 1A shows the frequency of each symptom by COVID-19 status. The proportion of participants reporting at least one moderate to severe symptom was higher in the previous COVID-19 group, 56% to 47%, or a 1.5-95% interval. So not only did having a previous infection make it more likely to have a moderate severe adverse reaction to vaccines, 56% reported it. Now, although these effects were most often things like pain, myalgia, and so forth, they are still symptomatic. Right?
Okay.
Now, if we go back to the CDC paper, if you have a previous infection, you have only a 0.0276 chance of going to the hospital with COVID. The Israeli study shows you have a 0.16% chance of having COVID with any symptom. If you get vaccinated, it lowers those numbers so little it's statistically insignificant. And yet, for odds that small and potential benefits even smaller, you have to take a medication that you have a 56% chance of having a moderate to severe side effect. That's monstrous.
Sorry, man. I'm trying to read some of the
That's all right.
that you're thinking. This is a lot. I mean, I don't know, man. I don't know. I haven't read these studies like you have. That's the difference. And then,
well, you acknowledge that many studies, right, show that there are people self-report like to the tune of 50% significant effects, side effects from the vaccine. I know people personally that had it and said, I had a horrible headache for 3-4 days. I couldn't get out of bed and things like that. That would be monstrous if there was no benefit to the vaccine to force people to take something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we weren't going through a pandemic, then it wouldn't be...
What does that matter? Even
right?
if you're going through a pandemic, if there's no benefit to them, to force them to do something like that would be monstrous.
Well, it's because, I mean, the reason is because you're being, exposed to it.
What does that matter? But again, then we go back to the CDC paper that shows if you had a previous infection, which is the people we're talking about, forcing them to take this, where there's a 56% chance of them having a moderate to severe side effect, where they get when there are statistically almost no risk of having a serious case of COVID anyways, and they get no benefit to being forced to take the vaccine, but we're going to make their life hell unless they do, and force them to take a medication that they have a 50% chance of having a moderate to severe side effect? There's no defense for that. I could steelman your position. The best defense would be, well, we were just rushing it and we just wanted to do everything we could to end COVID, so we just said, here's a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, I think that's probably what the CDC was trying to
but
do.
Even if that's true, then that seems to belie what the entire reason I was doing this video was, which was these crazy vax conspiracy theorists. Well, the people that were talking about side effects and about how the vaccine not being right for everyone, me for one, was right. So they jumped the gun and it ended up harming people. And you could say, well, they didn't know. Well, then all the more reason to have a public discourse and public debates on these things instead of censoring people. It gets worse, by the way. The data gets worse, right?
I mean, Gazette et al., the 2021 paper that you wrote, you linked, it says, given the previously infected individuals may have had multiple infections prior to the study period, the overall applicability of the study to all populations needs more clarification. Lastly, these findings should not be taken as an endorsement that getting infected is a better overall option for protection than the highly effective vaccines that are available, as only those who survived initial infection were eligible for analysis. Right, that's kind of like what I was saying.
Right. So what you see is that's why I picked this study amongst others, because I was trying to pick studies that it couldn't be accused were anti-vax studies. These are, you'll admit that it seems based on that they're not saying vaccines are bad, right?
No, I agree, and
right.
The thing is that they're coming to different conclusions than you're coming to.
No. The thing is, the data is the data. They can drive to the conclusion. So what they're saying here is what a bunch of people have said to criticize this argument from the get-go. They're attacking an argument that I'm not making, and that argument is, oh, you're telling people to go out and intentionally get infected with COVID, but that's a bad idea. That's not what I'm doing. For example, take their argument here. Well, it only counts people that are alive. Those that contracted COVID and died of COVID wouldn't show up in this data, correct? That's something that you're saying.
Yeah.
But that's the population of people we're talking about whether or not to force to vaccinate. The people that are dead are already dead. So let's say that there's 1 million people, right, that we're talking about that got COVID, and 100,000 of them died. Okay, now we have the 900,000 that didn't die. Should we force them to get vaccinated? The data says no. That's what it says. That's different than saying, okay, now here's 1 million people that haven't had COVID. Should we force them to be vaccinated, or should we tell them to intentionally get infected with COVID? No one's saying that. No one's talking about that population. What I'm talking about is...
The problem is you don't know which camp that 900,000 would fall into, like the dead or the...
Yeah, I do know. I do know. Every single... how do I know? Every single person that was in this study isn't dead. That's how I know.
No, but if they had a previous infection, they could, right?
Okay. Again, let's go back to the CDC paper. It looked at 1.37 million people with a previous COVID infection, correct?
Yeah, okay.
Those people aren't dead!
Okay, you're talking about the people that had a previous... Okay,
yes.
I understand now.
Now,
okay.
I don't doubt that some people that had COVID died, of course. But that analysis only matters if you're looking at someone who hasn't had COVID and isn't vaccinated and saying, which way should you go? That's not my argument. My argument is there are large swaths... At this point, more than half the people, I would guess, in this country have had COVID, right? Even back when this paper went on, remember at one point, the CDC had to admit they underestimated by 50% how many people had COVID in this country, right? We're talking millions upon millions upon millions of people, as the CDC study itself shows. At the time of that study, there were 1.37 million people in California alone that had a previous diagnosis who weren't vaccinated. That's a huge percentage of that population. The question is, should we force these people to be vaccinated? So, yes, you're right.
Go ahead. Sorry.
You point out that, yes, that's exactly why. I'm glad you point that out, because in the past when I've talked to people, they were like, oh, you just intentionally pick studies that were anti-vax. Quite the opposite. I picked studies that I started reading the conclusion, and they were like, yay, vax, everybody should get vaxxed. And then I looked at the data in them. And almost every time, it turned out that the data wasn't telling the story that their conclusion was telling, right? Now, they might not have sought to answer the question that I was asking, right? Which is, this particular groups of people, should we force them to get vaccinated? That's what our government was doing. That's what it was trying to do. And so I'm not saying that the study was intentionally obfuscating the results. They might not have been looking to answer that question. But when you look at the data, it shows the answer is no, right? And this is what blows my mind. The people that are like, well, the side effects are rare. They're not. They're not rare. Almost every study I could find had people reporting 30%, 40%, 50% of people saying they had significant side effects. And you could say, and we'll get to this, but you could say, yeah, but they weren't super severe side effects. Just because it's significant, it's noticeable. So what? You had a headache for 2 days. Right? But remember, the majority of COVID cases for people in the majority of age groups were also asymptomatic or non-severe. So if that justified all the crazy shit that we had to do for that, then why would we all of a sudden say, but significant side effects, we're not going to look at that?
Because the people that had like adverse vaccine side effects would probably have had even more drastic COVID-19 drawbacks. I mean, that's the kind of
okay. Let's say that's
bad.
Let's say that's true
with the vaccine. Then the viral load and the different infections with SARS-CoV-2 is going to cause it's going to be a lot harsher on the body.
Okay, let's say that's true, right? Then that would justify forcing them to take the vaccine if it gave them significant protection to prevent them from getting COVID, correct?
Sure, yeah.
But it doesn't, as the CDC paper shows. It doesn't. They already have almost a minuscule chance of contracting COVID if they have a previous infection, and they have an even insanely more minuscule chance, like only 10% of that, of having a significant case that needs to be hospitalized, and that slightly increases if they're forced to take the vaccine. So your argument could make sense for the general population. You could say, well, this data in this CDC paper seems to suggest if you are unvaccinated and don't have a previous COVID diagnosis, that you're far more likely to contract COVID, far more likely to have a significant case of COVID, and the data does show that. But that's not the population we're talking about. We're talking about those that had a previous infection. And so given that, if we force them to take a medication that has a 50% chance of giving them a significant side effect and they get almost no benefit, clearly the cost outweigh the benefit. And yet you couldn't even have this conversation. You were considered an anti-vax conspiracy theorist. You were censored off places like social media. And this is what I'm saying. Like, I haven't looked into the origin of COVID and that story as significantly as I did this, but I was shocked. I started to look into all of these papers that were like, yay, vaccine. And the data was all pointing to the same thing. Every single time. And it starts to make you wonder if this peer review was so strong. No one spoke up at the CDC. No one spoke up that was doing all these papers saying, look, although we recommend the vaccine for people without a previous infection, and maybe some people with previous infection don't have immunity, so they should actually get a blood test. But yeah, for those that do, they stand to risk significant side effects for almost no benefit if they get vaccinated. Instead, this is what I heard. You tell me if I'm wrong. This is what I heard ad nauseum. Well, double protection is better than single protection. So if you've had previous case, there's no harm in taking the vaccine on top of it. That was the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
So then lastly, I'll just finish this up. The JAMA Network study also concludes vaccines are good. It says that side effects from vaccines are rare, which is true, the significant ones. Here's what it says in the paper. After one dose of BNT162b2 mRNA, 8,680 or 8,682 participants completed the adverse effects survey, and 64.9% reported adverse effects. After 2 doses, 80.3 reported adverse effect. I mean, that's insane. 64 after 1 dose had adverse effects from the vaccine. 80% had adverse effects after the second dose. The most common effects, though, were fatigue, muscle pain, headaches, chills, redness, swelling at the injection site, joint pain, and fever. Okay. That's a huge amount of people. Go ahead.
Is this a study on a JAMA paper that's analyzing the VAERS stuff?
No.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if it's using VAERS. I don't believe so.
There it is. Okay, I'm sorry. You linked it to me. I didn't.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at it now.
It's looking at nearly 20,000 participants, so I don't think it's just from VAERS.
Gotcha.
But now let's finish up here. So I'll admit those 80% of side effects is huge. That's a huge number. But if they're in redness at the injection site, is that a huge deal? No. You would agree with that, right? Like, that's not a big deal. But here's the final nail in the coffin. The most serious side effect from the vaccine is anaphylaxis. And it is rare, but how rare? Allergic reaction or anaphylaxis was reported in 26 of the 8,600 participants, or 0.3% after 1 dose and 0.2% after 2 doses. So if we take this data and then line it up with the CDC paper, here's what we find. According to the CDC paper, those with previous infection had a 0.0276 chance of being hospitalized with COVID. But according to this paper, if those people get the vaccine, they have a 0.3% chance of having an allergic reaction. That means your risk of having an allergic reaction is 10 times greater than your risk you would be hospitalized with COVID. That's inhuman. Why would we force that on people?
I mean, this is the first time I've seen this. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to explain.
Do you starting to see why people like Hotez don't want to debate? You understand why people don't want to debate me on this?
No, this is fine. I mean, I appreciate it, and like I haven't read this, so it's hard for me to say.
That's fair, and that is totally fair. And anyone watching that, I've had that happen where people are like, read this study. Obviously, you're not going to. It's difficult for you to read it in totality while we're talking. I get that.
Yeah.
But the links are there. You look at it.
Yeah.
And I'll also link you the write-up I did of this. I also had a Twitter thread on it, but you can tell me. You can come back and tell me if you think that I was erroneous in anything. I don't think I was. Okay. Right? The problem is that's just one group, right?
Yeah.
Right? Now, let's go back to my initial claim. I think for certain people, if we did a cost-benefit analysis, the vaccine probably was beneficial. For example, if you have COPD and you're 80, if you got COVID, probably looking at a pretty statistically high chance that it was going to be a severe case, right? Like, I believe, I could be wrong, it's close to this, right? But did you know that the average age of death from COVID in this country is beyond the life expectancy? So it's like 77 years old is the average age of COVID death, and life expectancy for men's like 76.5 or something like that. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at young, healthy people, this disease wasn't that bad. It just wasn't. And so it's two different things, right? Like, this is going to seem like I'm being bigoted or something. I'm not trying to be, right? Take something like HIV, right? There's certainly a segment of the population that should be very concerned about HIV. But then there's another segment that, although that should be something on their radar, it's not really a big concern for them based on their lifestyle, right?
Okay.
Or there's other illnesses of a similar nature, right? That's sort of what COVID was. There were a lot of people that it was a really significant risk for. I think that the numbers are blown out of proportion and how many people died and things like that. But let's steelman and take the numbers at face value that we've been given, those numbers paint a story that shows the younger you are, the far less risk you have, to the point where at some points it was the safest respiratory season for people under the age of 15 that we've had in 20, 30 years. Now that may have changed after Omicron, but up until then, that was the case. No one was dying of the flu. Young people weren't getting the flu, and almost none of them were contracting serious cases of COVID. All the people dying, more people have died over the age of 75 than under. Right? And so when you're thinking of solutions to this problem, you can't just have a one-size-fits-all solution where it's like, well, a lot of 78-year-olds died of COVID, so we're going to force 3-year-olds to get vaccinated. That's fucking crazy. And so, like, when you're looking at this, right, you say the government is suggesting forcing people to do things. Now, there's a question as to whether or not they have that right. But let's say, for the sake of argument, they do. You're not a libertarian or something. In order for you to accept that, they would have to prove their case in a very significant way that it was necessary, that the cost far outweighed, or that the benefit far outweighed the cost. They didn't do that even remotely. They censored people that had legitimate objections. They censored people that said, is it safe to give 5-year-olds this vaccine? Censored. Is it safe to have 4 or 5 boosters? Censored. No debate. None. They issued policies where they talked about the reasoning for the policies was to make people's lives hell unless they took this medication that they wanted. And the truth was, for many, many people, it didn't make sense. For example, the ban on foreigners that aren't vaccinated, famous person would be Djokovic, the tennis player. He's at like almost no risk to contract or spread a significant case of COVID. We leave people in the southern border, illegal immigrants, that haven't had previous cases or any medications. We leave them in, no problem. But this person with the ability to get tests and stuff, sorry, no. We're not going to do it. It made no sense. We masked children. It made no sense. We locked children down from schools. It made no sense. And yet this is the problem. That's why when I see Hotez and a bunch of other people saying, don't talk to these crazy conspiracy theorists, I'm not going to defend everything RFK says. I've probably seen less than 1/1000% of the things RFK said publicly about vaccines. I don't know. I assume he's wrong about a lot of stuff. But the idea that we're just going to broad brush, oh, that's conspiracy theory, anti-vax shit, we're not going to talk about that. The ball's on them when they've been wrong over and over and over again. And that's what's going on. It's that they don't want to debate because they know the facts aren't on their side and they'll be exposed. So it might be true that he could make RFK look stupid on 80% of what he says. But he stands a lot to lose if all of a sudden we could be like, look, you said to vaccinate children, but that was a big mistake. You wanted to force it. It doesn't matter if you're right about the other 80% of shit. How do you defend that?
Yeah, I mean, So I guess the bigger point is that these are, really interesting findings in these reports, and I appreciate you actually going to like actual reputable resources for them and reading them. But I would argue that I guess that a lot of the the anti-vaccine general anti-vaccine stuff doesn't really have the same.
Well, that could be, but whose fault is it that those gain legs then?
I'm sorry, you did that last part again?
I said that could be. That could be. Like, let's say, let's take it into an area I know more about, right? Mm-hmm. Conspiracy theory. 9/11, right? Okay. So when 9/11 happened, I was a senior in high school, and one of the first things I thought, being zero interest in politics, but I was like, you remember the movie Red Dawn? Right? They made a remake of it too, right? But I remember watching that movie when I was young, and the plot, if you haven't watched it, I don't know what the new one's about, but the old one was Soviet Union flies airliners over and drops paratroopers out, and then they into the Midwest, and then they take over and blah blah blah. But that was a fear during the Cold War. My parents have told me they used to do drills where you had to get under the desk, nuclear war drills and shit, crazy stuff. But the idea was that we had adversaries that could do some bad shit if they flew overhead. So then somehow a bunch of, people without any technology whatsoever were able to attack 2 buildings, and then after that attack what should be the most secure building in the world, arguably, the Pentagon. Who got fired? What policy change was there? Like, that seems incredible. How did that happen? What if instead of bin Laden, it had been the Soviet Union, and it would have been a nuclear weapon? Are we that ill prepared? And so I don't think those are unreasonable positions, right? The questions to have. And you know what? 90% of the time when I ask those questions, you know what I was told? Why do you fucking hate this country? Oh, you're saying the towers were holograms? Fuck you, conspiracy theorist. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, why am I getting lumped in with that? The reason that the more outlandish conspiracy theorists get legs is because the people that say, you have to trust us, you have to do what we force you, and we'll censor anyone that disagrees, are fucking wrong so often. They're unwilling to have the conversation. And so the natural reaction is the void will be filled. People will say, don't trust them. Here's what they're wrong about. And then someone will say, and also they're wrong about this. And they might go too far. But who can you blame? The CDC and Dr. Fauci's official position, you tell me if I'm wrong about this, they came out initially and said, don't worry about masks. Masks don't help. That's what they said in March, right? Early March.
Yeah.
And then they said, never mind, masks work. And we had to lie to you because we were afraid you were all going to go out and buy all the masks, right?
Yeah, that's what they said.
What do you think that does to millions of people? That are like, so you're admitting that you lied to us?
Yeah, that was not the best way to start a pandemic. I totally agree.
Yeah, it was, and furthermore, they said cloth masks worked, correct? Maybe not as good as N95s, but they did say cloth masks worked, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why instead, so put yourself in their position, right? So let's say here's the truth. I'll spoil it for you. The truth is they didn't know shit about masks. They suspected they didn't work because when it came to previous, aerosol infections and things like that, masks didn't do shit. That's what the majority of studies were saying, right? So but then it became politically expedient to say, not only do they work, but you should be forced to wear it, right? Because it was a virtue signal. It was a compliance thing that they wanted to do, right? But, so that's, either they didn't know or they suspected masks didn't work. That's what I believe. But their narrative is, no, we knew all along. So they're lying to us, right? Still, they're lying. We knew all along. But let's assume that that's right. So they knew all along that N95 masks worked and cloth masks worked, but they were afraid that if they told us that, we would all rush out and buy masks, and then the hospital personnel wouldn't have them. Why didn't they say this? Hey, do you have an old t-shirt at home? Cut it up and then put it over your face. Don't worry about going and buying a mask. Your cloth mask will work just as good as that N95. If they had to tell a lie, why wouldn't they tell that lie?
No, I agree. I think that, wasn't there a thing where they were going to send a mask to everyone in the United States and then the DHS stopped them?
I don't know.
The CDC had a plan for
there was that. I know there was a plan for testing, which inevitably did get sent. I don't know about the mask, but that sounds reasonable. That sounds like something that...
Yeah.
I mean...
I honestly, my main thing that's come from the masks is damn, dude, medical, operating doctors wear really shitty masks. Why aren't they wearing N95s?
There was all kinds of problems. Yeah. There's all kinds of problems with the mask narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you, before the vaccine or aside from the vaccine, either way you want to look at it, what was the best way to prevent the spread of COVID? In your opinion?
Probably not letting those diseased cruise ships into the United States.
Well, okay. Okay, I wasn't thinking of that, but in general, right, that's still going in the direction I want. So, robnoerr's, I'm me, right? And it's what can he do? You could wear a mask, you could take orange juice. What would be the best thing that individuals could do to stop the spread? They recommended a couple things. It was one of the things they recommended. What was it?
Are we in January 2020? When
sure.
are we?
Or even beyond that, right? What did they tell you?
Well, I mean, it's a coronavirus that we know pretty well, right? So it's going to be a respiratory virus. So anything that you could do to stay away from other people, right?
Social distance, right? That's what they
Yeah.
said, right? And so the two things they were really beating in our head before the vaccine was social distance and masking, right? That was the big two, I think.
Yeah.
Right? So you know how many people I talk to, particularly on the left, right, that would say this? They'd be like, oh, you fucking Trump supporters at their rallies and blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, you went to a rally. And you know what they'd say? Yeah, but I wore a mask. And I think that masks, let's assume for a second that social distancing would have worked. I think masks and the rhetoric around them, seeing as how we now, would you agree, it seems to suggest particularly cloth masks weren't that effective. I think the rhetoric actually made things worse. Because people looked at them like they were some sort of bulletproof vest. I got my mask on, so I don't have to social distance. I can go out in the big crowd. And I'm better than those right-wingers that didn't wear the mask and went out in the big crowd. So it's okay for me to do it. And there was other problems, right? This is, in general, everyone. Like, no one was out there publicly, like, just saying reasonable shit. Like, maybe because I think you're involved in science to some degree, right? I mean, your name's peer review, so I would assume. Mm-hmm. Like, no one ever told me the proper way to wear a mask. Now, I know you're supposed to wear it over your nose, but you're not supposed to fidget with your face, right? Or, how about this? Like, you're not supposed to re-put a mask back on. Because the moisture that gets... I would wear the same... Because I had to wear it for work sometime. I'd put the same damn mask on for like a week. Which was causing more harm. I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably better than nothing.
Well, I've read studies that suggest the opposite. That actually, not just coronavirus, but because of the moisture, it's a breeding ground for bacteria. And so actually re-putting that on is actually worse. Right? And it's like, now you might say, well, Rob, you're a fucking idiot. Yeah, but so are millions of people. Right? And it's like,
no,
I didn't know.
You can wear them. I think that's fine.
Yeah. I never understood anyways why they didn't just have someone, 10 minutes a week going on national television just being like, here's simple things. Like, wash your hand. We don't know if it'll work or not, but here's the proper way to wash your hand, right? Did you know that, like, many of the places you get groceries from have delivery services? There was nothing. Instead, it was just, shut the fuck up. Do you want grandma to die? That's it. That was the discourse. And, oh, sorry, we had to lie to you about masks. These people...
Yeah, I was...
And then you go back, right? It's so funny. Like, I debate left-wingers like Destiny, right? They're like, well, the best thing to stop COVID was the vaccines. Let's say that's true. Okay. If we accept that is true, right? If we look at the two administrations, the Biden administration or the Trump administration, who has been more consistent on advocating for the vaccine?
That's actually a good question because Trump is actually a huge proponent of it.
That's right. Yeah. And Biden, if you go back and you look at what Biden and Kamala and them were saying, and Democrats, they were saying, we wouldn't trust this. Trump's trying to rush it before the election. I don't know if I would trust it.
Well, he was trying to end the third clinical study and trying to
maybe true. True. But what do you think there were people out there going, oh shit, I don't trust this then? They said Trump's rushing it.
Well, if he had stopped the clinical trials early, then we'd have the reason to be concerned, right? But I didn't do that.
Do you think there was reason to be concerned under Biden?
For how they've handled it, or the vaccine development?
Rushing things?
I've been a little frustrated with like the Biden's, like how they've the Biden CDC, how they've kind of like kind of the same thing, kind of talking about messaging and not being clear.
How about this story? From September 2021? This is Business Insider. 2 top FDA officials resigned over the Biden administration's booster shot plan, saying it insisted on the policy before the agency approved it, reports said. Oh, what's that? The Biden administration told the FDA that they had to approve this because they'd already made the policy? So much so that 2 top FDA officials resigned? Mm-hmm. Well, that's weird. That's weird. We heard those criticisms about Trump allegedly rushing things, but he ended up not doing it. But when Biden's team literally did that with the booster, you just said, had Trump done that, there would have been reason to be concerned. Okay, well now 2 FDA officials resigned over the boosters being approved cause for concern?
I mean, changing the RNA sequence is a little bit different than just like the original tests for.
Hashtag that's different. That's what you're saying. Why did they resign then? Why did they resign if it's no big deal?
I don't know. That's a good. I mean, I'm happy that they felt they weren't going to be persecuted or they weren't going to have the clap back, in order to do that. Then I don't know. I don't know why I don't know.
But the point is then, right? When I talk to left wingers and they're like vaccine, it's like your side would say. I remember watching the news leading in. I was very into the 2020 election, right? I remember watching the news and it was verbatim. If you put on CNN or ABC, Meet the Press, whatever, and they were like, "Oh, Trump keeps touting that this vaccine's going to come here, but it's going to be really difficult to get one in time and his time frame, and we've never had vaccines develop that fast, and Trump's rushing it, and I don't know if I would trust it." That was the mainstream narrative. That was the Democrat narrative. Do you remember that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
And then as soon as they won, it was like, oh, never mind, vaccines are cool and you should all be forced to take them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at like the institution of science trying to, trust what science is saying in general versus what like some politician is saying what the science says, Well,
nonetheless, many scientists were saying at the time, unless you disagree, that it would be very difficult to develop a vaccine that fast because it had never been done before.
I mean, the RNA delivery technology based off of lipid nanoparticles has been done for a very long time. That's what Malone got famous for in '89 for delivering GFP to mice.
Yes, but when it came to creating a vaccine specifically for a disease, none had ever. Mm-hmm. For example, coronavirus has been around for a long, long time, and we still didn't have a vaccine for it, right? And to see a new strain of a virus that we haven't had a previous vaccine be developed that fast was pretty much unprecedented. I'm not saying that proves that it was nefarious. I'm just saying it was unprecedented. We'd never seen one develop that fast.
Yeah, I mean, basically the technology had been developed over the last 20 years, and it was specifically because of the parts of the RNA vaccine that aren't translated into that spike protein. So you can kind of basically make it more stable over time. So that's the part that took like 15 years of molecular biology research in order to get that, and then you just change the sequence, and then boom, you have a vaccine. So that's why it was so fast.
Okay, well then, if that's the case, right? Why before COVID-19 didn't they develop a coronavirus vaccine if it was that easy? And why aren't they doing it to a bunch of other viruses that they're now able to do this very simply before they reach pandemic levels?
Aren't they doing that? Isn't that what the flu vaccine is?
I don't know. But if they've had the flu vaccine and had this technology for years and years and years, why not a coronavirus vaccine?
Why not an RNA vaccine, I think is what your question is?
Well, you're claiming that the RNA delivery system is something that they've been developing, and that's what allowed them to create this COVID vaccine, right? That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
So well, then why didn't they create one previously? I mean, they would have stood to gain a lot of money.
Well, every year they basically do environmental sequencing to know what the normal virus populations are, and then they kind of predict it for the future flu season. And then the difference is that they basically clone that piece of DNA into a DNA vector versus like having it only in RNA. The advantage of having an RNA based is that you can change the sequence faster. So they could the story is pretty incredible. They got the sequence in like January 2020, and then the human trials were starting like 2 weeks later. So it was like incredibly fast turnaround. I think that's why that they wanted to use that technology specifically, is because of the fast turnaround time. Yeah,
well, it nonetheless doesn't affect what I'm talking about, because the narrative that was going out there for the public to consume, they weren't consuming the background shit. By the way, it was also odd that Pfizer, as all this narrative was going, oh, no vaccine, Pfizer had already done 2 trials. So instead of making an announcement like, well, we had 2 trials that were successful, but we need to do a 3rd before we could get this to market, instead they waited until after the election and then announced before Biden was sworn in, by the way, we finished 2 trials and we're on to trial number 3.
I mean, they have this child, like, they're going to be continually going for, like, for a
Sure,
long
but what I'm
time.
saying is that, like, there was an odd, when the narrative that the public was consuming was we're nowhere near a vaccine, when the people creating the vaccine knew that wasn't the case, but instead of going public to correct the narrative, we just, the same people that said we don't trust that this vaccine could be that fast, then all of a sudden when they won, they were like, yay, we trust the vaccine, it's great, you should have to take it. And then the vaccine companies come out and said, yeah, and we finished the tests. We're doing good.
Well, shit, man, if you want the scoop, I could give you the latest in nanotechnology research on delivering DNA, and then you could just get the scoop years ahead, over a decade ahead.
Nah, I'm good. It'll even if you're doing it for good reasons, it'll probably be used for something for shit, you know, or it'll be buried because it actually could do good, one or the other. But
I hope not. That's what my PhD was in, so hopefully...
you're making
hopefully
gray
it's
goo.
something.
That's what you're making. I know about the
Yeah,
gray
exactly.
goo. Yeah, I know about
Yeah.
it. But yeah, I mean, that's... So in general, that's the sort of stuff that, like, when I see Hotez and them go out, at this point, what benefit of the doubt have they earned? They've been wrong so many times. I could play a clip of Hotez being wrong over and over. You know?
Yeah, I saw that on Twitter, too. Yeah, I mean... there is that part of science where you can hopefully as data comes out, you can shift your focus and shift where maybe and explain the previous study and the previous set of data a little bit better. Any study is going to create more questions, so but I'm curious though, like so I consider myself pretty patriotic, and like I'm curious why. What really makes me mad, basically, is what people are saying, that like 1 million Americans didn't die, and it just like really like rubs me the wrong way, because it's kind of like these are 1 million families that have been impacted, 1 million people that have been Americans that
Sure.
have been killed by this thing.
All right,
So
I'll answer that question. But I also am concerned. I could show you video after video. I could play. I had a radio show. I had people call in. I listened to Jesse Kelly's radio show. I play a clip after clip after clip of old man and woman died alone. Lockdowns. Family loses their home because they were told that they were non-essential workers. Children with speech development issues now. Suicidal children. Children with all sorts of psychological detriments. A generation of children educationally falling behind. All based on trust the science, we need to do lockdowns, we need to force kids to not go to school. All bullshit. All bullshit that we are told to trust the science. So it's interesting because the anger you have of people saying that many people didn't die and you think they did, multiply that anger times 1,000, and that's what I have. Because the difference is between the people you're mad at, they didn't force anything on anyone. But the people I'm mad at did. They forced our economy to collapse. They forced our children to suffer. They forced elderly people to die miserable and alone. They force these psychological impacts on children and educational impacts on children. That's the difference. The difference is you could be wrong. You could say stupid, dumb shit, offensive stuff. But if you don't have the power to force shit on other people, then at the end of the day, the harm you're doing is you might be convincing other people of their own free volition to agree with you. That's different than having the power to force people to take a drug against their will and it has a negative effect, or to lock down against their will, or to not be allowed to see their family against their will. And it's even more egregious when you find out that the same motherfuckers that were forcing that on us normal plebes were out there living it up, doing whatever the fuck they wanted. They didn't follow their own rules. They did whatever they wanted. So I would say I'm probably 1,000 times angrier at the trust the science crew that was wrong over and over again. But to answer your question, I think the number of people that died was overestimated. We know that's the case. First off, that's the case anytime, right? So that's hardly saying anything. For example, they probably overestimate how many people die of the flu each year. Would you agree with that?
I haven't been tracking the flu deaths enough to know.
It's funny because at first I was comparing flu numbers to COVID numbers and was like, I was shocked at how many people a year die of the flu. But then I've read some credible shit that's like, those are sort of estimates and it's probably overestimated, the flu deaths. Which is detrimental to my argument, because if I'm saying COVID's not that much worse than the flu, well, if I'm admitting that the flu numbers are probably overblown, that's not good for my argument. But I think that's probably true. But it's hard to collect accurate data anyways, and if there's a new course du jour, a new disease out there, probably it's going to get blamed for some things. But then when you put in the financial incentives, that saying that someone died of COVID, and so you're getting money from the government because of that, it seems that there was a incentive to do so. So I could tell you anecdotal stories about seeing gunshot victims that were wrote down as COVID deaths. But instead of that, I'll tell you straight from a coroner here in Pennsylvania. So I believe this would have been June or July, I could be wrong, of 2020. So it was sort of early in COVID. And our governor, Tom Wolf, a Democrat, was waffling back and forth between county by county approach or statewide approach. And so they went with the vaunted red, yellow, green system. And if your county was red, you were locked down. Many counties had 0 COVID deaths, right? And so I believe it was Lycoming County on my radio show. I talked to the coroner, and this coroner it's a small rural county in central Pennsylvania. And he was shocked to find out that the state reporting numbers, and this was being read at the time, it was headed by Admiral Levine, who was then Health Secretary Levine. And he saw that his county had 14 COVID deaths. And as coroner, he would have been aware of each and every one of those. And instead he had 0. So he called a couple coroners in the counties around, and they ended up calling the health secretary's office, and after a couple days got in contact with them. And the state had said, our mistake, we assumed looking at death certificates that it must have been COVID. And they ended up having at one point, now granted, this was early, right? But they ended up having to retract 1/5 of the total state COVID deaths. Now, if that was because it was caught by, admittedly, a politically biased coroner that was I think they're blowing this shit out of proportion. But what if you were in a county that had an incentive, whether it be political or financial, to say, we're just going to let those count go, right? We're just going to let it go. So it's clear that there were numbers that were overcounted. Now, you might say, but were they undercounted as well? Perhaps. But I will say this to you. Certainly a lot of people died. I'm not going to tell you, was it, actually 80% of what we're told? 90%? 70%? I don't know. But anyone who claims that a shitload of people didn't die, it's just not true. They did, right? Now, was COVID the sole cause, or was it a contributing factor? We could debate until we're blue in the face. But I agree with you. There are those that have said, no one died. It's all bullshit. It's fake. And that's not true. That's just bullshit. It's not true, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the people that died that were counted as COVID was accurate. How would you know? I've thought about this. It's difficult. The best way that you would be able to test this was to say, okay, let's look at the average death in this time of the year, in this area of the year, pre-COVID and then post-COVID, right? So let's say, for example...
expected deaths.
Yeah. Right. So in 2019, if in June in 2019 in the entire state of Pennsylvania, 30,000 people died, and then in 2021, 200,000 died, okay. Now, does that mean all the excess deaths were COVID? No, it could have been other things. And it could have been lockdowns. It could have been the reaction to COVID. But in general, I think it would be fair to say that COVID contributed to some additional deaths if you're seeing that stark of a number. I think that's fair. I guess that's my take on it. But when it comes to being angry patriotically, why would you be more angry at those people than the people that lock down kids?
I don't know. I guess we just performed really poorly, compared to other people, other countries, in our same socioeconomic class. We just were performed very poorly compared to South Korea, for example.
And it's South Korea, but why would you compare to South Korea? South Korea is basically a peninsula.
Because they had the same first day of COVID infection.
That's hardly the spirit. What you would want to do is look at a similar population, when it comes to comorbidities, when it comes to there's so many factors, right? So for example, you could do climate, right? And I've had these debates ad nauseum, right? So I've said, I've had debates where it's well, if you're comparing Florida to New York, well, you can't do that, people say. Why not? Because Florida's more temperate. New York's colder, so it's automatically going to have more respiratory illnesses. And it's like, okay, but if that's the case, then how can we compare the United States to New Zealand or South Korea? Well, that's different. You know, and there's obviously not going to be an apples-to-apples comparison, right? I think, though, you have to ask yourself, right, who is the impetus on to prove the people that wanted to do things like lockdown, right? Anytime someone wants to force you to do something, they have to make that case, right? Doesn't that seem fair? Like, if I tell you, like, you should eat tuna every day, that's one thing, but if I'm going to force you to eat tuna every day, that I have to prove that then, right? So the countries that did lockdowns, they didn't just say, well, lockdowns will save a handful of lives. They said it would be devastating if we didn't have lockdowns. You could look at the United States. Remember the DNC was putting ads out about Florida? The Forever Purge. There were people crying on TV, on the news, about how bodies would be piling up in Florida. Then when we look at the numbers, despite having a more aged population than New York, which I use because that's the state that Dr. Fauci said did the best, their mortality rate was right about the same. I think at this point, Florida is slightly worse than New York, but it's like 26, 27 or something like that. Their per capita deaths, right? And so it's not just, and this is what happens when you say this is what people say. They'll say, well, but if Florida would have locked down more, then they would have done even better. But that wasn't the argument. The argument was, if they don't lock down, it'll be hell on earth. And so, we could compare to New Zealand or we could compare to South Korea. How about Sweden? They didn't lock down. They did better than us. Right?
That's a good question. I think that I remember one of them being just kind of like a go for it, no lockdown. But I'd probably argue that like the United States didn't really do much of a lockdown, especially when you look at the GPS tracking. It's pretty insane.
Well, that's that's another point, right?
Mm-hmm. And basically, it was only the rich people that were allowed to lock down, and everyone else like had to go out and do their job. So,
like, let's say that this is now. You can believe me or not, but I assure you, I was saying this in March of 2020. I was criticizing. I was offered a job through Trump's campaign, making like $25,000 a year, being the point person in my county, right? Basically knocking on doors, putting up signs. I turned it down because they said I had to end my social media, which I was like, I'm not going to do. A week later, serendipitously or not so, depending on how you look at it, I was furious with Trump because he started to embrace lockdowns, which I was like, this is a huge fucking mistake. So I said this is the first time I made this analogy was like March of 2020. I want to lose weight. So I go to the doctor, and the doctor says, here's the deal. I have 100% guaranteed way for you to lose weight. And it's important to lose weight because your blood pressure and because risk for heart attack and stroke and things like that with obesity go up. But I have 100% way of you to cure your obesity, right? It's 2 steps. The first step is I have this pill, and you take this pill every day, right? And the second step is you have to eat moderately well and exercise every day. But if you do that, I assure you within a year you'll be completely healthy, right? But there's one catch. The pill costs $100,000 a year. Okay? And so there's a huge cost financially associated, but there's a cost, but the benefit's very good, right? What the United States did with lockdowns was this. They said, fuck it, I'll pay. Sure. $100,000 a year, I'll pay. And then they ate like a fucking pig and refused to exercise. So it didn't work. So they got the cost of the pill, but they didn't get the benefit. That's what lockdowns were. Unless you're going to have a lockdown that's like air fucking tight, it's completely worthless. And you can't blame the American people because they were intentionally set up to be so. I remember early in the pandemic going to Home Depot. And Home Depot in my little town had a rule that said like only 20 or 30 people were allowed in the store at a time. So what they had done was that, you know how like when you go to the bank, they got those like ribbons that like that you walk through the
ticker thing. Yeah.
You like to kind of keep the line. They had those set up outside Home Depot. So I showed up one day. There was probably 70 people shoulder to shoulder standing beside each other. If they'd have just let them in the store, they would have been 20, 30 feet apart from each other. But instead, here they are, standing shoulder to shoulder. The shit that we did was nonsensical. Right? It wasn't going to work. And so the question became, why even do it? If you're going to do it, then you have to do it totally. But the problem is, what country did that? The UK didn't. UK's numbers are damn near as bad as the United States numbers, if not worse. What country had lockdowns that you're like, there? Even places that we were told did it right, like the island nation of New Zealand, predictably, once they opened up, what happened? Well, their rates went through the roof. Now, it's still not as bad per capita as it was in the United States. But there's other things, like, for example, what's the big comorbidities for COVID? Age is number one, but what's the second one?
Probably like BMI.
Yeah. You think the United States is fatter than other countries?
Not anymore.
Really? Is that true?
Well, there's other BMI. There's other countries beating us now. Like I think Mexico's higher than us.
Are fat people all died of COVID? I'm still kicking. I'm doing all right. I'm losing weight. I'm doing all right. But you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of things. Or you could say maybe the healthcare system's better in a place like Denmark. So maybe just because their healthcare system was better in general when COVID hit, they had better results. Maybe it didn't prevent as many people from getting infected, but those that did had better care because there's a better healthcare system. There's a lot of factors, but this was the problem from the get-go was that it's non-falsifiable, right? And I knew this. I knew this would be the case. You know, I call this argument Schrodinger's Patriot Act, right? Because to me, the lockdowns and shit was very similar to the Patriot Act. Both said there's this big unknown threat out there that could kill millions of people, and so we got to take your freedom away to fight it. But the problem with that is, let's go back to the Patriot Act. So September 11th happens, and let's say there's parallel universe. In universe 1, we pass the Patriot Act. In the next 10 years, we have 0 terrorist attacks. Do you think that the government's going to say, I guess we didn't need the Patriot Act. It was a mistake. Terrorism wasn't that big of a deal. You think that's what they'd say?
It doesn't seem like it.
No, they would say, see, it saved us. The Patriot Act saved us. But what if there were 100 terrorist attacks? Do you think they'd say, I guess the Patriot Act didn't do anything? They'd say, see, we told you terrorism was bad. And there would have been even worse if we didn't have the Patriot Act. How would you prove them elsewise? Mm-hmm. Well, that's what happened here. I knew that. I knew that they would be like, let's do lockdowns, let's do mandates, let's do all this shit. And then when you were like, okay, well, there's no evidence that those things benefited, they'd say, yeah, it would have been worse if we didn't. How could you prove otherwise? Well, the best you could do is compare similar places. So we compare a place like New York to Florida. And they're like, no, you can't do that. They're different. There's too many variables. Well, then how could you make the claim that lockdowns saved lives? How could you make the... You know what I mean? Now, vaccines, it's a little different because we could see it's easier to look at a population of vaccinated people versus a population of unvaccinated because a lot of those variables will be erased, right? Because, for example, if your neighbors... then your geographic location's the same and your economic situation's probably similar. And you know what I mean? But with the lockdowns, you can't do that.
Yeah.
All you can do is take the areas that had significant lockdowns versus those that didn't and say, is there measurable differences? Not really, is the answer. Mm-hmm. Like Florida did pretty good, all things considered. Sweden did really good. And remember, Trump famously said that Sweden was fucking up. They needed to lock down. And then he criticized Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia. And I voted for Trump. I volunteered for Trump. But a lot of Trump supporters want to whitewash that. And it's funny because Trump's out there saying, well, DeSantis locked down. True. But Trump embraced the fucking lockdowns. He criticized the governors that didn't. So, I mean, the whole thing, like, it's okay to be like, well, we fucked up. But no one wants to do that. And especially the longer it went on, the fuck-ups were intentional. Like every Western country in the world came to the conclusion that preventing children from going to school was a huge fucking mistake. Except the United States. Now the CDC originally came out and was like, yeah, we're going to put this notice out saying that we're going to recommend schools go back. And then Randy Weirgarten and the teachers union, they were like, wow, we need to talk about this. And then magically Walensky comes out like 2 days later and is like, never mind. We're going to keep our guidance to keep schools locked. That's monstrous. It's unconscionable. And there was never evidence to suggest it. And the same is true. Like, the same is true of all this data that I'm presenting to you. Where was the evidence ever that we should force those with natural immunity to be vaccinated? Where was it? It didn't exist. But people fear-mongered you into it. I debated... Do you know Dylan Burns?
Mm-hmm.
Can you see my feed here?
Yeah, I can.
Let me play a video for you. Now,
okay.
You'll have to take my word for it that this is edited, that it's an accurate depiction. because it's a 2.5-hour debate. But this boils it down. My friend Drone Tech boils it down. Now, what I want you to watch for, I knew what I was trying to do in this debate was Dylan's advocating for vaccine mandates, and I'm arguing, look, the mandate is bad. Like, what's the easiest way to argue against the mandate? For me, it was simple. If I could find a population of people that the mandate is bad for or doesn't make sense for, then the mandate is bad, right? Because the mandate's all-encompassing. Do you see what I'm saying? So you could say, well, even if it makes sense for this group of people, if it doesn't make sense for this group, then we shouldn't do this mandate. Maybe we should adjust the mandate. But this mandate is bad. For example, if I was to say life in prison for all people that have ever killed someone, you might say, well, look at this drug dealer. He killed someone. Makes sense, life in prison for him. But then you might be like, yeah, but look at this guy with self-defense. Does he deserve life in prison? You know what I mean? So the law would be bad because you could point to a significant group of people that it would be bad to apply to. So that's what I was trying to do, was to differentiate how this mandate was bad because people with natural immunity shouldn't be forced to have their lives made living hell. And let's watch how this goes for Dylan here, just to get an idea.
But your argument, even for the vaccinated, or for the people that have had the virus, is we should force them to take the vaccine or get tested, right? You're saying that's the caveat, or force them to get tested, right? Correct?
Yeah. I do believe that that's probably the best way to do it. And honestly, Biden thought of it before I did, and I think it was
Great.
good that he was in charge of it instead of me, because I might have gone a little further.
So just real quick, just to get everything clarified before I make my point, you're admitting that the evidence seems to suggest that natural immunity is superior to the vaccinated, correct?
Yes, with the caveat that they should also get vaccinated as well.
Great, or get tested. That's your argument, right? They should get vaccinated or get tested.
Yes.
So you think that they should get tested or get the vaccine, even though they're more protected than the vaccinated, correct?
Say it one more time. I'm sorry. I just want to be very
You think
careful.
that people that have had COVID and have natural immunity should get tested or get vaccinated, right?
Yes.
And your philosophical premise to such is, even though it might be against their wishes.
But everyone, by the way. This is everyone, them included.
Okay. And so my question to you are you vaccinated? You don't have to tell me if you don't want.
Yes, I am. I have both vaccines.
Should you be forced to get tested every week?
No, because I'm vaccinated.
You're more likely to spread and catch the disease than people with natural immunity, and you think they should get tested every week?
I'm more likely to catch and spread the disease, but I think they should also get vaccinated. You know what, Rob? I'd be perfectly fine with people who have natural immunity going that route. If there was an exception, and you can prove that to me right now.
So wait a minute, what made you change your philosophical position? It almost seems like...
Wait. Wait, 1 second. Give me a moment here. Somebody's told me that's not true. I'm sorry. I'm trying to... I thought we were going to talk about something a little bit different here. So that's why... give me a second here. He's right here, actually. If he's saying affect everyone with COVID, Rob was right. Yeah, I mean, honestly... So
you just backtracked your entire position as soon as it was an imposition to you. As soon as it would have been having to get tested every week. Now you're like, you know what? Then people with natural immunity don't have to get tested.
Wait, can I not? Okay.
Now, obviously, I'm incapable of editing. My friend Drone took... But you heard basically what happened there?
Yeah, I need to get myself one of those. That's nice.
Drone Tech could edit something for you. He's great. He's a good guy.
No,
you have to be slightly right winger. But real quick, the point to that is like this is what's so frustrating, right? When you show people like, okay, if we look at these things, right, you can see how this doesn't make sense. Basically, most of these people that are saying like you're crazy conspiracy theorist, blah 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 blah. As soon as you're like, okay, well, why don't you sacrifice? You're more at risk than the people you want to sacrifice. Time for you to sacrifice. And they're like, well, no, that would be inconvenient for me to have to get tested every week. So now I've changed my mind. And that's in my estimation, why people like Hotez don't want to debate these things. Because they might just get wrecked. They might just get embarrassed because the truth is they don't have a mastery over the things that they're talking about in the first place. They oversold what this vaccine could do. They oversold what their policy prescriptions were. And instead of having to face the music, which they deserve to face, because they were encouraging people's liberty being taken away. They wanted the government to force, like Dylan wanted the government to force people to get vaccinated or to be tested every week. And so when you show that that actually was the wrong decision and it incurred harm, they deserve to face the music, but they don't. And that's why there are swaths of people out there today, the same people that want a COVID amnesty. They're like, don't debate these crazy conspiracy theorists. But the truth is, I don't know about RFK, I know about me, I'll fucking wreck them. I'd debate anyone in the country on the things I've talked to you about today. No problem. And it's not just because I'm a good debater, but I am pretty good. It's because I'm right. It's because the data backs up what I'm saying. And so I'm comfortable debating anyone. And if I'm wrong, who cares? Then someone will prove me wrong, and that's a good thing too. But I'm not.
Yeah, as a scientist, it was really tough during the pandemic because I was like looking at it and looking at the data ever since it was December 2019. I remember seeing it, and then January 2020. Every month, I'm just paper after paper showing more evidence that this is happening, and I was kind of shocked. My wife was really pregnant at the time, so
mine too. My wife
actually
got COVID when she was 9 months pregnant, December 2020.
Oh dang!
Yeah.
Well, congrats on that.
She's dead. So no, it worked out. Actually, we both got COVID at the same time. Mm-hmm. She was due the beginning of January, so we got it at the end of December. Her case was extremely mild, which we were worried about. Mine was a little more significant, but it was all right.
Yeah, because we did like the blood clotting thing. We had no idea going into it, so we actually isolated earlier. I isolated for like a whole year. Like I was doing working from the lab at home. We did exactly what you were talking about, actually, the getting food delivery. We still do that, actually, because now we have 4 kids, so it's a lot easier to do food delivery or groceries delivery than not, So, but yeah, man, we were wiping down groceries and not seeing everything. And I was extremely mad, especially at my scientist friends. They were continuing to do all this stuff. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? And then I look at the CDC and Fauci and was just being very wishy-washy, and it was the truth very frustrating.
The truth is, you might not want to hear this, but probably all your isolating didn't do much good. To be honest, it probably didn't. Probably the best way to deal with it, if you're worried about children who have almost no risk of it, or if you're a younger, healthier person, is to deal with it like other diseases. If you have obvious symptoms, isolate, stay home. Other than that, kind of live your life. That's probably the best way to deal with this. I should have protected. I said this again. I read some German doctor who explained it in this way. He was like, "There's 2 sorts of diseases that kill a lot of people." He says this in very scientific ways. I'm going to dumb it down for myself, which is 1. There's diseases with really high fatality rates, right? Like crazy high, right? And the way you deal with those is you quarantine, right? You try to, at all costs, stop it from getting out. So if they're some crazy, the Black Plague comes up in this small town, you basically quarantine the town and don't leave anyone in or out, right? But then there's diseases like the flu that kill a lot of people. And the reason they kill a lot of people isn't because their fatality rate's really high, it's because it's super infectious. So even if it's a really low fatality rate, but 1 billion people get infected, that's a lot of bodies, right? You get what I'm saying, right? And basically, he was like, when it comes to those latter diseases, you can't deal with it with lockdowns. You can't. It will eventually get out there. It's just too infectious. And so instead, what you should do is try your best to isolate and protect the most vulnerable population and let the virus run its course through the young and healthy population. And he estimated that that's what COVID would be. And at the time, people were saying COVID's fatality rate was like 6-7%. And I knew that was bullshit. I was like, and he knew that was bullshit. And that's probably what we should have done. And that would have had so many positive effects in so many other ways. For example, we know that exercise and things like that was a very important part of fighting COVID. Well, we locked people down. So a lot of people that elsewise would have been, isn't it funny? One of the places we were strict about locking down was gyms. I mean, it's nonsensical. We locked down parks and beaches and skateboard parks and things like that, outdoor venues. It makes no sense, right?
Well, I mean, they didn't. Well, they wanted to make sure that they didn't have broken arms going into the emergency room and stuff like that.
Yeah, but that's all horseshit too. Because if you look, actually, and again, this may have changed, so don't quote me on this. The best journalist I've seen in the country on this is my friend Phil Kerpen, who I knew from when I debated. Kerpen, the data he puts out on Twitter is unbelievable. I'm going to email him and get this data because I don't know where he finds it, but on average in the United States, hospitalization utilization was down since COVID than it was the years prior. Right? So we kept hearing these fear-mongering words. For example, Destiny, the left-wing streamer Destiny, said at one point, I can't remember the exact percentage, it was 70 or 80%. If ICU beds are at 70 or 80%, anyone who's not vaccinated should not be given access to those beds. But most hospitals run at 70 to 80% capacity, and they have for years. That's how they maintain profitability. If they had only 10% bed usage, they wouldn't be making money. And so Destiny monstrously is suggesting if hospitals are being used at the rates that they are commonly used at, we no longer offer health care to people that aren't vaccinated. That's the sort of shit that people were saying. It just... In my
I don't agree with that.
Right, I'm not lumping that, but I'm not lumping that into you. But the idea that hospitals were overwhelmed, sure, there were a handful, but that's you could take any random year and look at the entire United States. 2013, were there any hospitals overwhelmed? Yep, here. Right? It's that's when we look at it on average, the numbers weren't. The hospital utilization was slightly down because what happened was, I can tell you I shouldn't say this because I've mentioned it on stream before because it's a little personal, but my brother had to have brain surgery. He had epilepsy really bad to the point where he would have grand mal seizures where he's broken his collarbone 3-4 times. He would have them 30-40 minutes at a time. So he had scheduled to have brain surgery, and he's a young guy. He's 24 at the time. Mm-hmm. And that's a serious to make the decision that you're going to get brain surgery. It's crazy. That's got to be a tough decision. So, but that was considered elective. It was put off because Pittsburgh, that had almost no COVID cases, was worried that they were about to be overwhelmed. So the hospital said that's elective. Then in another incident, he had a seizure. My mom drove him to the hospital, and the way this normally went, he'd have one of these seizures. It would last for a long time, and then he'd have a down period. Then he would have more. And so she took him to a hospital in Jefferson County, Pennsylvania. Jefferson County at that time had 0 cases of COVID. 0. Not just at that point, up until that point. So she took him to the hospital. She was not allowed in because of their COVID procedures. So she decided it was probably going to be 12 to 24 hours. That's normally how long they kept him. And so she was going to sleep in the parking lot. To her amazement, an hour later, he comes out the front door. She's like, what's going on? They said I'm not having them and I need to go because they're worried that people could come in with COVID. So in the 20-minute drive back home, he had a seizure. My mom opened the door because he was in a seatbelt choking himself. So she opened the car door. He fell out of the car and shattered his collarbone again. Because we were so fearful that COVID was going to overwhelm hospitals. And that's what ended up happening. Hospital utilization was down because people either intentionally were afraid to go to the hospital because they thought about COVID, or hospitals were dissuading them from doing so. We actually had, I remember covering a story, they were actually laying off hospital workers and nurses in the middle of a pandemic. How does that make sense? No one's going to the hospital, that's why.
Well, they're not following procedures. I mean, they're not getting vaccinated, so.
No. This was before the vaccine. So it was UPMC, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, their health network laid off 500 nurses and hospital workers, even before the vaccine. This was in 2020, because there just wasn't enough business. Because no one was doing elective shit at the hospital. And that's where they make a lot of money, is the elective stuff. So, okay, no money. We can't have people. Then you wonder why there was an incentive for them to be like, oh, everything's COVID. Yeah, that's a COVID diagnosis. Oh, that person died of COVID. No shit, they were all suffering economically. And so it's it was really incredible, you know. So I don't buy the hospital overutilization shit. You remember they sent that ship to New York, they didn't use it. Remember Cuomo was like, "Oh, Trump's only sending 1,000 ventilators. What about all the other people who are going to die?" Now it looks like ventilators were killing people, and it turns out that New York didn't even need all those ventilators, and they shipped them off overseas. So everything we were told about this by these smug fucking people, you know, for example, in my state, we told people, young, healthy people, they couldn't go to work because they were non-essential. They couldn't go visit their parents in the nursing home, right? And the reason was, if you protested, they said, "What do you want, grandma to die?" Then our governor forced nursing homes where grandma was to accept COVID patients, thereby causing grandma to die. So the idea that young, healthy guy couldn't go to work because hypothetically he could bump into someone who bumps into grandma and give her COVID, so therefore you can't go to work, but we'll just send this, grandma's new roommate's going to be this COVID patient. Zero fucking sense. None. No rhyme or reason to it. The only explanation that remotely makes sense for that is, well, they were afraid that hospitals were going to be overwhelmed, and so they had to get the people out of the hospital, and the next best place is the nursing home. But why would you intentionally send them somewhere that you know the most vulnerable of people are? And then, is there any wonder they don't want to debate now? Because how do they explain? Oh, you know, maybe 20 to 30... At one point in Pennsylvania, 40% of the deaths were COVID or nursing homes. How do you explain that? Then we find out that another state that did it, New York, Cuomo, hid how many people died in the fucking nursing homes. They hid it. They covered it up. If that was Trump that did it, it would have been the biggest scandal in the fucking world. But it was a New York governor, so they just said, he pinched someone's ass, get rid of him. Forget about all that COVID nonsense.
How do you think that the CDC and like Trump should have handled it then? I mean, do they, because it seems like DHS and CDC like didn't want to like strong arm like anything, and it almost went to like the states in order to handle it separately.
Leaving it
and
up
then
to
there
the
was
states.
basically different states that kind of handled it differently, giving kind of like an incohesive like response. That's kind of
Leaving it up to
how
the
it
states.
feels.
Leaving up to the states was probably the best thing to do, right? In general, the overarching theme should have been this: we should have allowed the people that weren't at risk to basically live their lives as best as possible, and then use the resources to protect the very young with compromised immune systems or the very old with compromised immune system as better as possible. So think about it. Let's say you have, I mean, this is going to sound so stupid. Let's say you have $100 million in the state of Pennsylvania, right? I know it's well over that, but just a nice round number, right? You have $100 million. People working every day. That's the money that you basically got to play with as the government, right? So we could have used that money, those resources, to protect older people, to increase staff, to have more staff turnover and stuff in case someone got infected, and then maybe to increase PPE and things like that, right? But instead, we divvied those resources out instead of just protecting the vulnerable to protect everyone, and we halted the economy. So there were less resources to go around. So there weren't enough resources to help the people at the nursing homes. But my friend who owns a bar and restaurant here in town, he had a state worker once a week that would sit in his parking lot making sure he didn't sell 12-packs to people before noon. There's a good use of your state resources. That's the type of shit that was going on. And it's just, none of it made sense from the get-go. Even you admit. What good were the lockdowns if you half-assed them? I knew that. You knew that. Why would you send COVID patients to nursing homes? Me and you know that's fucking stupid, but this is what the experts decided. Locking down kids from school, there was never evidence to suggest that was good. I knew that, but that's what the experts decided. And so now when the experts are like, we're not going to debate these crazy conspiracy theories, fuck you. You've been wrong so many times, you don't get to act smug. Now, that doesn't mean that the person that wants to debate you is right about everything, but I'll be damned if you've earned any benefit of the doubt when you've been wrong over and fucking over and over. And by the way, you're going to be wrong when it comes to COVID origin, is my guess. I'm 80% sure that you're going to be wrong about that.
Okay, I might be, but I'm just waiting for the scientific evidence in order to point that. I mean, the thing is like, let's say the CDC I mean, would you have listened? It doesn't seem like people were just waiting for Fauci to tell them the quote unquote right thing. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't seem like during the pandemic Fauci could have said anything to sway public opinion. So I mean, what do you think the CDC should have done?
Well, what do you like? It doesn't.
Like, if they were, because they're an advisement, right?
Like, I think that.
Okay, I mean, they're an advisement. They're advising, right? They're not like making any laws. They're not passing any laws. They have no executive authority. But like CDC is also kind of like charged with this stuff. So like, I guess
my question is, that, in this hypothetical, what would I want them to do? You mean like from the beginning? Because
yeah, sure.
Okay,
yeah.
So like, you would think that the CDC is a little more prepared for potential upcoming viruses. So, for example, Dr. Fauci famously gave an interview in February that said flu's going to be worse than this COVID thing. That seems like there was a lack of preparation at some point, right, from them at that point. You would agree with that if that was their guess. Now, granted, you can't always be, but so if I had the ability to have clairvoyance, though, that would have been step one. You know, step two would be don't intentionally lie to people. Be as transparent as possible. Talk to people face to face. When people have questions, don't mock them and tell them they want grandma to die and that they have to trust the science and you're the face of science and any criticism of you is a criticism of science.
Yeah.
Be honest about the potential side effects of things. Like, here's a case. I could have made the case for vaccines infinitely better. You ready?
Okay.
Yeah, people are saying that vaccines have side effects. That's true, they do. Most medications have side effects and vaccines are no different. And it could entirely be possible that the vaccine won't be right for you. But it will be right for millions of people. And that's why we're encouraging you to talk to your medical professional. If you have comorbidities or if you're at high risk for a respiratory illness, it probably makes sense for you to get some sort of vaccine with this. But if not, maybe that doesn't make sense. And you're right to be concerned about potential side effects. And we're doing our best to look into these claims and we're doing studies and things like that. But we think right now, during this emerging pandemic, that it makes sense for a lot of people that want to take this vaccine to go ahead and do so. Now, doesn't that sound more reasonable than, you're crazy fucking conspiracy theorist? What side effects? There's no side effects. And
yeah, I mean, that sounds, I mean, yeah, I would give a very similar statement. I mean,
yeah, I don't know why they can't be honest with it. Like, their point of view is like, well, if we say there's side effects, then no one will trust it. Well, no, if you say there isn't, if you pretend there aren't, that makes it worse, right? It's like, that because then people are like, well, I don't trust it. And, you know, there's so much that we did, like, what ethnic group was the least likely to be vaccinated? Do you know? What racial group?
Black community, I think.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe the fact that we spent 8 to 12 years telling them that the pharmaceutical company, as most institutions in this country, was systemically racist had something to do with that?
Yeah, probably.
I mean, it's shit like that. It's like, I'm not saying you shouldn't be allowed to say that something's systemically racist. That's okay. But it isn't it interesting, right? The type of shit that, because when you start to get into the politics of it, you know, people are like, I blame Trump for, you know, his handling of COVID, but what about Biden? Who did better, Trump or Biden? Right? Like, I think it's a reasonable question. What's the fundamental difference in the policies between Trump or Biden? Let me ask you, what do you think the greatest tool we had to fight COVID was, in your estimation?
That's a great question. I don't know what's the afterwards, like, a posthumously, like, what was the biggest thing. I mean, I'd probably think the vaccines. That's after
what most, particularly lefties, would say vaccine. Okay, right. Well, we already went through Trump's championed vaccines the entire time, much to the chagrin of many people on the right. Biden and the Democrats were hesitant at first, but then they came on board. But if that's the big thing, right? Remember, Biden famously said, we want to be getting, 1 million doses a day out. That was achieved when Trump left office. So Trump dealt with a brand new virus, right, that they arguably knew next to nothing about. Struggled, right? I totally fair. I criticized him probably more than you did for shit in the opposite way, embracing lockdowns and shit like that. But nonetheless, that's fair, right? Okay. Then he got a vaccine, right? What Biden deal with? Well, Biden already knew a bunch more about about the virus when he came in, and the vaccine that was basically his only tool policy was this vaccine was already developed and being handed out by the time he came into office. What policy-wise did Biden do different than Trump? Other than potential vaccine mandates and getting vaccines out, which is what Trump was doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I agree that it's more of like an engineering, like, efficiency thing that Biden had to deal with versus kind of like a research development and...
well, if we look at it, but the engineering was already done. The goal that he set was already being achieved when Trump left office. And if we look at it by the numbers, in the same time period that Trump was dealing with COVID, when Biden was dealing with it, more people died under Biden. And what was the major... By the way, you could answer how you want when I asked what the difference was, but inevitably, 90% of the people I asked this that hated Trump and have defended Biden, this is what they'll say. Well, it was more about the symbolic stuff that Biden did. Biden told people that masks were good, and he told people that vaccines were good, and he told people to stay locked down or to social distance, and so that's what it was about. It was about the symbolism. But you can't say that if you say that the most important thing is the vaccine, because Trump's been unwavering on the vaccine and Biden wasn't. And it turns out masks barely did shit. So the fact that Biden put a mask on for a photo op, that's it? That's the big fucking difference?
But I mean, Trump went on for months and denied that it was even a problem, that there is even a pandemic and all that kind of stuff for
Who do you blame for that, Trump?
a really long
you
time.
You blame Trump for that?
Well, I mean, we had known the data and stuff. We had known for a long time, for months, before he
Do you think
eventually
Dr.
acted in
Fauci
April.
at this point is carrying any water for Trump?
I don't think so. No.
He seems to have an antagonistic relationship with him, I would say. Fauci has said, because what you're talking about is, the Woodward interview, which Trump's a fucking idiot for continually talking to these people in the media like they're his friends. But Woodward said, Trump was privately telling me he knew how serious COVID was. Well, at the same time, publicly, he was saying that it wasn't a big deal, right? Well, two things. First, what do you want your leader to say? Oh, we're all fucked? No. They're going to put a positive spin on things, particularly in an election year. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, it's bad if it causes people to be unprepared, but in my estimation, people that are without comorbidities should have been living their life anyways. It was the people that were elderly and had comorbidities, and Trump was admitting that it was a danger to them anyways. But more importantly, secondly, Fauci said, in response to this Woodward interview, that Trump's public claims were totally in line with what he and the other experts were telling Trump to say. That's what Fauci said.
Yeah, I mean, that's not good either. I mean, I'm reading
how could you blame Trump then? If Fauci was the one, and it would make sense because, right, that fits right in line with the CDC and Fauci and Dr. Birx, right? That's what they did with masks. Oh, we're afraid we'll scare the shit out of people and they'll run and get masks.
Because like, for example, with the cruise ship, the CDC was going to quarantine those people with PPE, and the DHS, which Trump is the head of, he's the full executive. The DHS overruled the CDC and allowed those people to just walk right into the United States without any type of quarantine or anything like that. And it's just like,
I don't know. Maybe Trump personally made that decision. My guess would be he had some sort of expert tell him that was the case. I also am unaware that would have made any marginal difference whatsoever. I think inevitably the virus was going to spread and like keeping people out. Trump. But the other question you have to ask yourself then is, well, Trump as leader, who, if it wasn't Trump, if it was someone else, what would they have done differently? So Trump tried to stop international travel, and he was called xenophobic by Biden.
Well, in April, man. I mean, I was like way late.
So what? The Democrats were criticizing him then.
It's
reasonable to think had they been in charge, they wouldn't have even wanted that.
I mean, the vaccine development for SARS-CoV-2 started in January.
Okay. And?
So January, February. So like we had already, and the WHO had already proclaimed it as a global pandemic. Like,
Then why is
Yeah,
Fauci
the
giving
sequencing
interviews?
was out.
Why is Fauci giving interviews in February saying that the flu's going to be worse?
I don't know. I don't know why he's saying that stuff either. I don't know.
I don't like. Look, I blame Trump for an awful lot of shit that I think he should have his head wrapped around, like budgets, spending money, shit like that. I'm not going to buy he doesn't know, he's a novice. Fuck all that. He knows about money and budgets. He gets that, right? Same with foreign policy. He might not be a details guy, but the general nature of it, right?
Yeah.
But, like, I don't blame him for being like, I don't know about this fucking virus, right? And then his top guy's like, what do you think? And his top guy's on TV like, I think the flu's going to be worse. What do you think, Trump was going to overrule him? You think he was going to be like, well, I just have a gut feeling. Now, to be honest, there are people like Mike Cernovich that was calling Trump out early and saying, you should take this more seriously. And it seems as if what happened was the Democrats understood politically that they could make hay if they did a 180. Because the Democrats' original position on COVID was, oh, that's xenophobic, Trump's being racist, right? Remember Nancy Pelosi coming out, go to Chinatown and hug a Chinese person. Remember that shit? That was the original take. Well, that shit wasn't.
Well, yeah, because Asian American hate crimes are going up, right?
So what? Russian hate crimes go up, and we haven't stopped people from claiming that Trump was a Russian spy. That was all bullshit. And by the way, the majority of those Asian American hate crimes are still going up and has nothing to do with COVID. Turns out, I'll just put it this way. Doesn't look like it's a lot of Trump supporters committing many of those Asian American hate crimes, right? We stopped talking about them real fucking quick once it turned out like, oh boy, it's more of like Nation of Islam type people, not someone who's angry about COVID, right? So that's what it was about.
I don't know who's committing that. I don't know. That's a good question.
Right, but the idea, like, it's easy to do, like, you just spout that off, like, well, what's the data show? Were Asian American hate crimes going up like 3 months prior to COVID being a thing? Were they going 2 years afterwards? Right? Because it turns out there's a lot of, particularly in inner cities, there's a lot of hate crimes that go on against Asian Americans. Take that for what you will, right? But the idea that we're just blaming that on COVID, I don't know. Was the Rodney King riots where Korean grocers were getting broke into? Was that COVID too? I mean, it's just it's fun how we selectively cite those sort of things. But it's clear that no Democrat in a position of power was taking it serious. In fact, they were criticizing Trump, saying that he was pretending to take it serious, but was really just xenophobic and racist. But they weren't saying, go hug a Chinese person because of Asian hate crimes, but we need to lock down, we need to do this, and we need to do that, and we need to quarantine. They weren't saying that. Quite the opposite. It was more politically expedient for them to be like, this isn't a big problem, and Trump's just racist. So that's the angle they went with. And then they saw it was like, oh boy. They had their cake and ate it too. Once they saw, okay, it's a bigger deal than we thought. Then it was, oh, Trump didn't do enough. And all the Trump supporters out there, myself, which was one, that's not entirely unfair. Right? The buck stops somewhere, right? So it might
one
be
last
true
question.
that,
I gotta go do dad stuff. But I'm curious, like how you understand or treating or like your risk assessment of like long COVID. So there's, I say that because there seems to be like people that contract SARS-CoV-2 leads to serious COVID-19 symptoms and they just like don't come back. There's like a crazy fatigue that's associated with it, and a lot of the science and research is still ongoing about it, trying to kind of undermine why this is happening, why it would be so severe in some cases, but some people are asymptomatic. It's kind of like a weird idiom that's happening in science. So I'm just curious your thoughts.
I think that both with that and with long-term vaccine side effects, that the jury's still out. I really do. I think that there is an incentive for people to claim long COVID is more significant and more proven than it actually is, because they need to post hoc justify the terrible decisions that they made, right? And so when we see that actually the vaccine didn't do a hell of a good job of preventing transmission, or at least it was massively oversold, that it was a pandemic of the unvaccinated and all of that stuff, they have to try to justify it in some way, right? Because it turns out that COVID wasn't a big threat to major demographics in this country. Young people, healthy people, people with previous infection. And so long COVID clears a bunch of those warts up, because it's like, well, we don't know. In the future, it could be really bad. So we had to do everything possible to stop everyone. Even if it initially looked like it wasn't a big deal to you, it could in the future be something that's a really big deal to you. So, I don't know. We'll have to see what the data suggests on it, but let's assume for a second that it's true, like that long COVID is a thing, right? Again, we could look at the people that had previous COVID infections, right, and see, based on the CDC's own number, at least when it came to Alpha and Delta, that they were less likely to contract COVID than those that were vaccinated. So even in that world that long COVID was a thing, if you were trying to pick either vaccinated or previous case of COVID from getting COVID again with the potential to get long COVID, you would still pick the previous case. So, in other words, if you get vaccinated and you still have a 50% chance of contracting COVID, what's the difference? Like, if long COVID's super real and super severe, okay, now what? What do we do about it? I don't know. Boosters in perpetuity? And then we have to look at then each booster comes with each potential side effects. And then what's the long-term effects on children of this vaccine? How the fuck do we know? We don't know. You can't know, because the vaccine hasn't been around long enough and been used on children. And yet, we're recommending children take it. And so I don't know. I smell bullshit, I'll tell you that. I smell bullshit just like I smelled it when they were saying, all these stories. The Kyrie Irving, the NBA, because he won't get vaccinated, blah, 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 And it's like, dude, this guy's probably one of the healthiest people in the world. He's a professional fucking athlete in the prime of his career. And you're going to shit on this. Like, you could just smell it. You're like, something's not right here. This is fucked up. Like, that's what it feels the same thing to me. It feels like, here we go. It's non-falsifiable. It's in perpetuity. It's just, nope, you got to keep taking our medication. You got to keep the threat going. Got to keep it going. That's what I see.
Well, speaking of falsifiable data, so my plan is to put out a, I don't know, it's probably like a 15, 20-minute video. I'm going to try to go through papers looking at the COVID origins kind of stuff. And, yeah, man, hopefully I could get your feedback on it and we could chat about it. That's more my wheelhouse.
I've done these debates, but it's been so long. Do you know who I'm talking about? The New York Times writer. He's no longer with them, but he did the first paper that was kind of like it.
Oh,
Nicholas,
the lab leak thing.
Yeah,
the guy that was doing the weapons of mass destruction articles.
I don't know about that.
One of their global news reporters was pushing lab leak, and is also one of the main people that was pushing the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq thing. So, kind of crazy.
Well, I mean, fuck. If we did a Venn diagram of the people that saying vaccines are good and push the Iraq war, I think you'd find that the majority of people pushing the vaccine said the same thing, because it's the establishment orthodoxy, right? So I don't know if that's reason, but yeah, I mean, fuck, yeah. There's certainly a ton. Nicholas Wade.
I'll check him out.
Now, this was 2021, but I debated Sonsel on this a couple of times. I'm a
microbiologist, so
I would think you'd do better than Sonsel. Sonsel's claim. My claim was always, I'm open to hearing. I was just pissed about the censorship of it, right? And I was like, I feel that the evidence more strongly suggests that it came from a lab. However, I'm totally open to having my mind changed. I am. The only problem I had was with the censorship. Because Sonsel's claim was, and I'm quoting, it was debunked that it came from a lab, which is bullshit. It was not. It never was. Well, and now that credible places are saying, or at least credible in Sonsel's eyes, and left-wingers' eyes, are saying it's actually more likely that it came from a lab, right? Maybe people don't use debunk to mean the same thing I do. Debunk means proven not true. The lab leak has not been proven not true. And so
there is a slight possible chance that it is, and I'm going to talk about that in the video. Basically, in order to encompass this type of evidence, this is what would have to happen, and that's kind of like what I would expect. Make sure you put your
sources in the video, and I'll check it out, and then I'll look at the sources. I can't look. My work schedule is fucking crazy, so I can't give you a time frame, but I will. Because
cool, man.
It is a subject that I'm interested in. Will you acknowledge this? If it did come from a lab, one, you would already say, I think you already admitted, that the censorship of that is wrong anyways. But second, if it did come from a lab, like, you do understand the implications of that the United States, including Dr. Fauci, funded the lab to do the research that caused the virus. You understand the implications of that, right?
Yeah, I know. But it's, it's one of those things where, we have to kind of like work, politics, science is political, and you have to be able to, do the science in the country where, all of this is happening, and getting access to those bat caves and getting for environmental sequencing and all that kind of stuff is, it's hard. So, that's why a lot of these, people are interconnected kind of thing. And I don't know, man, what I found is being in science, like as you go up and up, there's less and less people. So, at the very top, there's if you're looking at a world coronavirus expert, there's only going to be, a couple people in the world. That's why they're the world experts, right? And it's kind of like the same thing with my PhD research, right? I'm like the world expert in whatever that is. So,
yeah, but when it all drives towards the people doing the research have a motivation to come to the conclusions that they're doing, they could even subconsciously be making decisions that they don't realize are screwing up what the science says. But it's more nefarious than that when you see that, like, people like Daszak and Fauci that are directly implicated in the possibility of the creation of this virus being the go-to people for saying that we should silence people that are criticizing the very action that they may have led to. I mean, there's clearly a conflict of interest there. And I
mean, it's tough because it's like, I got my algae research was funded by the DoD, and I got one of their national fellowships. So, did the DoD send me here tonight in order to like shill for for the vaccine? You know what I mean? You could draw like
like, for example, with the lab leak, right? Like, if you personally signed off on sending money to the Wuhan lab, and then you're on here like, no, my God, it couldn't have came from a lab. I think that's pertinent information for the audience to know. And certainly if you were in a position of authority that you could lead to the censorship of people like me, I think that's really pertinent. Because it's like, well, you have a big stake in this. Because Dr. Fauci is not only the most, I believe when he left his position, was the highest paid executive branch member, I believe. But even aside from that, he went from a relative unknown who had slightly negative reputation based on his treatment of HIV and AIDS in the past to one of the biggest celebrities in the world. Yeah. Imagine going from that to, now you're not a celebrity and you're blamed for the creation of this virus that you were the hero in saving it. Like, so there's skin in the fucking game there. And so for that guy, to be so adamant that we need to silence people that are talking about this, and then when you see, as well as I do, I would assume, right? When the initial discussions were going with like sort of the team that Fauci was emailing and stuff, there were several people that were like, this looks like it came from a lab to us, and Fauci and them were emailing them like, no, and then they changed their story real fucking quick.
Yeah, it's hard, man. I mean, the emails just aren't scientific evidence. That's the biggest thing.
That might be true. I don't disagree, right? But the question is the science sound, right? And
that's going to be my task.
Okay, let's say that you prove the science is sound, and then all of a sudden, the FBI's like, we've found these emails that were leaked to us that shows that here's the exact documents that these scientists were creating this fear and cleavage site and creating this, and this was done, and then what will you say?
I mean, you have to show that's where it came from directly, and that nobody else was doing that, and that's just that. I mean, the fear and cleavage site isn't unique to SARS-CoV-2. It exists in other viruses.
I think that if we get intelligence, provable intelligence, not just the FBI's word on it, but we actually see documents that is these scientists talking about the creation of basically what became COVID, I think that's pretty damning. Right?
Yeah, I mean, but there has to be like scientific evidence, like sequencing, that kind of stuff, and we don't have that. I mean,
we'll see. We'll see. Produce. I mean, I've heard these big claims before. I've heard that it's been debunked, and no one credible says otherwise. And then I looked into it, and I was underwhelmed. But maybe you'll do a good job. So.
I actually did my own Freedom of Information Act request for the DOE information that led to that low confidence report on the COVID origins. I have not heard back. My FOIA got redirected.
Let's not be dishonest. I believe it was medium confidence. There was 7 intel agencies.
I thought it was low confidence from the Wall Street Journal.
I believe, if I remember this, the low confidence were the 5 agencies that said that they thought it was zoonotic. That was low confidence. And then it was medium confidence from the FBI, I think. It could be.
Well,
or I don't think medium's the word they use, by the way. I don't know.
It's a frustrating, like, you know, I just want more transparency than just like hey, we asked this guy that is familiar with the report, and I was really disappointed in the Wall Street Journal, like, kind of airing that. And even the New York Times, they did a really poor job reporting that. I felt like it was all just word of mouth, word from word. And I understand, like, protecting sources and all that kind of stuff, but, like, at least get someone that's get the report, you know, redact the report and see the report before you report on it. So
yeah, it's
anyway,
I'll have to look. It's this is the first thing that comes up in the FBI's assessment: the origins of COVID-19 pandemics, most likely a potential lab incident. The National Intelligence Council, along with 4 other unidentified agencies, assessed with low confidence that COVID was most likely caused by natural exposure. The Department of Energy, which previously undecided, concluded in low confidence that it most likely came from the lab. But
that's what I was talking about. That DOE report.
I believe the FBI was more than low confidence. I think it was medium confidence. Which I thought was funny at the time, because that was the argument. Oh, low confidence. It was like, no, the people that concluded your way were low confidence. And no one said shit then. When those 5 agencies came out, they weren't like, oh, it's just low confidence. They said, that's it. Censor people. But I'll let you get going. I know you go. When you have that video, I'll show it on my channel. And
oh, cool, man.
We'll look at...
And remember, I'm still saving that date for the Inflation Reduction Act climate change stuff, too, remember? We're going to talk about all the wins that we've had from that one.
Oh, sure. How's that inflation reduction coming?
Good, man. Less than Trump, apparently. So
what? Yeah. Well, you know, it was funny because they admitted, like, well, it wasn't really about inflation. It was about climate. Then just say that. It was bullshit from
I said that in my video, like, about it. I was like, dude, there's more climate change in it than I mean, it's focused on, like, permanent long-term jobs versus, like, you know, monetary things, which the Fed should be doing anyway, right? So, but yeah, I thought, yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool. I mean, we spent more money on science and engineering research this year than military spending. So hopefully we get some
gain of function going on. So that'll be good.
I know, dude.
That'll give us something to deal with in the future. If your grandma didn't die this time, next one will get her. So.
Yeah, we need that gain of function in that algae so we can have our renewable biofuels. That's what we need.
Yeah, that causes respiratory. All right, we'll see you. Thanks for calling in.
All right, thanks, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah,
bye.
And let's go. That was the peer review. I'm glad he called in. I know it was a little ornery at the beginning there, so I know I was going to wreck him. But I think you could see when it comes to I'm not here to defend comments that RFK made or anyone else. I don't know all the comments they made. I know the comments I made, and I'm called a conspiracy theorist when it comes to the vaccines and shit like that. And I know I'm right. And I know, even when I debate people that are in the field of science, that I purport myself quite well because I've done research on this. So to conclude, all of the people that are out there saying, don't debate the conspiracy theorists, blah, 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 don't give them oxygen, because they're afraid that something like that will happen. I don't think the peer review did poorly, but I think anyone would admit, even him, that I certainly had a point to make. So, all right, let's find someone to raid here on Twitch. I probably streamed longer than I should have. I get a good night's sleep tonight, I hope.
What? Wait.
Oh, let's see. EOD's on. Rating. Get me on Tim Pool or Joe Rogan or something. I'd love to wreck some people. By the way, props to peer review. Most people, particularly lefties, steadfastly refuse to debate me when it comes to stuff related by COVID pandemic and things like that. Right, XQC. He needs it, huh? So, all right, enjoy this raid of EOD. Thank you all so much. If you want to help me out today, you can always send me money. That's great. But consider following me on Kick. Do I ever go on Twitter Spaces? I tried once. My phone was acting weird. Made me sound lispy, so I haven't since then. But yeah, I'll get back into it once my work dies down. All right, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate all of you. I should be back around 8:30 tomorrow. As always, have a good one.
Imagine it to be. This process of negation, this process of struggle, in the Marxist